Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Eric Olson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Latin American Program and the Special Advisor to the Mexico Institute on Security. Ladies and gentlemen, you can take your seat up here. You don't have to sit up there quite yet. I'll call you up when it's time.
Just getting
Thank
glasses.
you. Otherwise, you'll be sitting up there a long time before you start. All right, thank you very much for coming. There have been some travel difficulties. I know that you were looking forward to hearing Duncan Wood this morning, the director of the Mexico Institute. He was in Toronto visiting family, and his flight was canceled, so he shall be arriving mid-morning at some point. But I'm happy to fill in for him and to welcome you all to our 5th annual conference on security in Mexico, taking stock of the security landscape there. And we have 3 panels today, well, actually 2 panels and a keynote address that delve into some of the key issues related to security in Mexico, a look back at 2017, and a look ahead to what we can expect in 2018. I want to take just a moment to recognize a few people. I'm not sure everyone's here yet, but I wanted to recognize first, more than anything else, Major General Luis Rodriguez Bucio. He's the president of the InterAmerican Defense Board, and the significance of this, I think, is that this is the first time Mexico has presided the InterAmerican Defense Board, if I'm not mistaken. So congratulations to Mexico, and congratulations to General Rodriguez Bucio. I'd also like to recognize the agregado from CEMAR, the attaché, Vice Admiral Octavio Trejo Hermida. We've gotten a chance to talk with him on many occasions, and he was here with us at a panel with Rebecca Bill Chavez last year, so we're always delighted. Bienvenido, está en su casa. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. And I don't know if Brigadier General Andrés Fernando Aguirre Osunza is here, the attaché from Sedena. I don't see him yet, but he apparently will be here at some point, so we want to welcome him as well. Thank you all for being here. This has been a really interesting year. I'm talking here obviously about 2017, and there's a lot of anticipation for what will come in 2018. Let me just hit on a few key issues in the security agenda in Mexico from last year and going forward. Despite a very complicated political terrain, and let's be honest, NAFTA negotiations, talk of a wall, immigration policies, anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, the stray tweet here and there. The landscape has been a little complicated when it comes to security cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico. But I think it's safe to say that the military-military relationship remains as strong as ever between both countries. And I think it's a testament to the seriousness and the professionalism of militaries in both countries. We have a paper that I want to call your attention to by Inigo Guevara, one of our regular consultants, that deals specifically with that relationship. It's called More Than Neighbors, New Developments in the Institutional Strengthening of Mexico's Armed Forces in the Context of U.S. Mexico Military Cooperation. That paper is available on the back. It'll be available online. And I think Inigo makes amply clear that the relationship between the militaries, despite all the other atmospherics, let's call it, is stronger than ever and growing quite well. A second development this past year was the passage of a long-debated and sometimes controversial internal security law, and that's been on the agenda in Mexico for many years. And if those of you aren't familiar with it, it's been a debate around the legal parameters and protections for the military as they engage in law enforcement and public security activities in Mexico. So that's been an important development. As I say, it's been controversial for some. We have developed our own little cheat sheet, if you will, called Mexico's Internal Security Law. If you haven't seen it yet, grab it from the back, and it lays out some of the arguments against it and some of the arguments in favor, and it's still something being hotly debated in Mexico. Third, there's been a dramatic increase in homicides, over 25,000 in Mexico last year in 2017. This is setting a record, the highest homicide rate in the country since official statistics were made available from government agencies. The question, of course, is why? Why is this happening? It had peaked out 22,000 more or less in 2011, then started a downward trend to 215, but why is it back up? And I think this is a very important question. It's causing many people to question the strategies and what is the best way to deal with homicides and violence in Mexico. And to that end, I want to point you to a little exercise we undertook called Why Are Homicides on the Rise Again in Mexico? What can be done about it? This will be posted. It's in the back on the back table. But really, it's the response of 4 terrific academics and practitioners who are engaged on a daily basis on questions related to crime and violence in Mexico. And they offer their ideas, their analysis of this deplorable trend in homicides in Mexico. So I really recommend you take a look at that as well. Fourth, the debate about rule of law and corruption in Mexico have become really a very salient issue. According to some polls, Mexicans are concerned about corruption is second only to their concern about the extreme violence as they head into the presidential elections. It has become a front and center issue for Mexicans, where as many as 14 present-day and former governors are under investigation. But it's also touched every level of government, the municipal level, obviously the state level with governors, but even the federal government, federal officials, and even at times questions and scandal around the presidency. So there's no question that this has become a relevant issue and a matter much debated in Mexico. How are we going to strengthen the rule of law in Mexico? How are Mexicans going to strengthen the rule of law? And what is the appropriate role for the state in that process? We have invited two very special components of our conference today. One, a keynote address by Mariclara Costa, a citizen member of the Council for the National Anti-Corruption System, Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción. She will be giving a keynote address after the first panel on this issue of corruption and what is it being attempted in Mexico to address the issues of corruption. And then our last panel, which is very important, I think, as well, brings together experts on the question of rule of law. We have published a new book that was overseen by Viridiana Rios here in the front row. We will be presenting that book, launching that book today. There are copies on the back. The book is titled The Missing Reform, Strengthening the Rule of Law in Mexico. And several contributors to this book are here with us today and will be talking about issues related to reform of the police, reform of the justice system, and efforts to prevent crime in Mexico. So we are really going to tackle this issue as well of corruption and rule of law in Mexico. So with all that, I am delighted to welcome you to our conference today. I am going to invite our first panelists, members of our first panel to come forward now and join me up here, and we will get started in just a minute. Thank you all for your attendance. For a moment there, I thought I left my notes on the printer. But anyway, thank you all for being with us. As I mentioned in the opening remarks, the question of the relationship between U.S. and Mexican militaries has been front and center for some time, and there is evidence that that relationship has actually been strengthening and become much more collaborative and open and over the last several years, frankly. And that, despite, as I say, some of the difficulty in the political terrain, we are glad to say that things remain on track. We have assembled a illustrious body, a panel of experts on the issue of military-military relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. Let me introduce each of them briefly, and then they will each make a presentation, and then we will have time for questions from the audience and dialogue between ourselves just after that. We're going to start off with Dr. Craig Diehr. Craig has served on the faculty of the National Defense University since January 2001. Dr. Diehr came to the College of International Security Affairs in March of 2010 from the Center for Hemispheric Defense Study, where he served for 9 years as Professor of National Security Affairs and Dean of Academic Life. Most recently, he served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Conference. National Security Council. He has written a book, and I apologize, I forgot to write down the name, but he has written a book that came out recently, and he will be talking about that, right, in your presentation, that traces the history of the relationship between the two militaries. So thank you, Craig, for doing that. I'm going to introduce the other three speakers quickly, and then I'll turn it over to you. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs from 2013 to 2017. Prior to joining the Office of the Secretary of Defense and Policy, she was Professor of Political Science with tenure at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Her research has focused on Western Hemisphere security and on cooperative politics and comparative politics, with an emphasis on the rule of law, democratization, human rights, and Latin American politics. Raised in Austin, Texas, Dr. Chavez received an MA and PhD in political science from Stanford University, and as I mentioned, while she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, she was on a panel with the agregados. I keep forgetting that word in English.
Attaché.
The attachés.
Not in English.
In English. The military attachés, when we had a very interesting discussion about the relationship. So thank you, Rebecca, for being with us. Next, we'll hear from Gerardo Rodriguez Sanchez Lara. Thank you for coming. Gerardo is a professor and researcher at the Department of International Relations and Political Science at the University of the Americas, Puebla, in Mexico. He's also a co-author of the Global Impunity Index and Mexico's Impunity Index. Gerardo is a postgraduate professor of the main civilian and military academies in Mexico and is a member of the Colectivo de Seguridad con Democracia. And he just handed me a book that he published last year called Seguridad Nacional en Mexico, National Security in Mexico y sus problemas estructurales, its structural challenges, let's call it. So we are delighted to have Gerardo here to provide sort of the Mexican view on this relationship as well. And last but not least, our good friend and collaborator, Inigo Guevara. Inigo Guevara is director at Janes Aerospace, Defense, and Security. He's responsible for supporting the growth and expansion of the aerospace and defense consulting practice in the Americas. Inigo is a subject matter expert in Latin American armed forces, focusing specifically on the Mexican military, including arms trade trends, defense industry developments, and procurement policies. And as I mentioned, we're launching today his paper, called More Than Neighbors, New Developments in the Institutional Strengthening of Mexico's Armed Forces in the Context of U.S. Mexican Military Cooperation. And he has been a long-term collaborator with the Mexico Institute. So thank you also, Inigo. So with that, let's get started here. Craig, you have the floor. You're welcome to come up here. We'll put up your presentation. You're welcome to do it from there or over here. You gonna do it there?
Sure.
Okay. Let me just recommend that Rebecca and Inigo just push aside a little bit because for better viewing. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Hey, good morning. Is this on?
Yeah,
Hello, hello.
we're good.
Buenos dias. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the opportunity. We are on the record, yes?
Yes, we are on.
Can never be too sure about this. Oh, and look, yes,
We're even webcasting this.
a shameless plug for this book. I can safely say that it's the best book-length treatment of this topic because it's the only book-length treatment of this topic. I could just look at that for the rest of the day, but please, let's, next slide. It is you could be one of the first 10 to own it if you go to Amazon. It's like that.
First 10?
20. Yeah. So, where to start? I guess I'm a living fossil because I was there when this relationship started to change. I was a young attaché. Well, so not then.
That's Santana.
Not then. Here's post-Cold War. I was there. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so when we think about the U.S. Mexico defense relationship, I show those previous slides to underscore that that we start. The relationship begins from a period of a lack of trust, shall we say? For those of you who don't recognize the painting, that's the Battle of Chapultepec, September of 1847. Next slide. And of course, after that, we have a period in which the young nation of Mexico is struggling, perhaps not unlike today, between conservative and liberal values. Next slide. And even during their revolution, we managed, the neighbor to the north, managed to be involved. La Decena Trágica and other sorts of things. Next slide. To include, toward the end, well, actually in the middle of the revolution, the gent to the left is Rear Admiral Mayo, the commander of the naval U.S. forces outside of Veracruz and Tampico when we have the unfortunate incident in 1914. And of course, the gent to the right, then Brigadier General Blackjack Pershing looking for Pancho in 17. So it wasn't just an isolated incident. And I wrote the book because I happened to grow up in Mexico. I did high school there. And when I talk to my American friends and they say, well, why sometimes don't Mexicans like us? And I said, well, you got an hour? Sit down. I'll tell you a story or two. So we go beyond all that, and suffice to say that the relationship had been cordial but distant. You know, Alan Riding's Distant Neighbors sort of captures that nicely. And of course, coming out of the Reagan administration, where the relationship had not been terribly wonderful at senior levels, the defense-to-defense relationship was similarly distant. But that all begins to change in the late 80s, early 90s, and the role of the leadership of these two gentlemen was essential. Next slide. They're drinking the forthcoming NAFTA agreement. I use this slide to reinforce the notion that there was some political cost, domestic political cost to Carlos Salinas when he was trying to move this forward, he understood that he needed to hitch Mexico's wagon to a locomotive of growth. China wasn't an option then, maybe now. And so he looked north, but he at some cost. Does anybody recognize the, I mean, I know certain people do, but for those who don't, that's Diana the Huntress, La Cazadora Diana. And I show the picture because back in the day, as he was undergoing this challenge, they said, what do Diana the Huntress and Carlos Salinas have in common? Does anybody know the answer? I know some people do. And it's because los dos están dando las nalgas para el norte. And if you don't understand what I said, ask one of your neighbors. He did. So again, there was a challenge. Next slide. So in the midst of all that, we have for the first time a U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General Gordon Sullivan, who in 1992 was the first in that position to ever visit Mexico. You know, we've been neighbors for a couple hundred years. The Mexican Army in its current configuration since 1917, a U.S. Army Chief of Staff had never visited. Kind of amazing. And when I interviewed him years later, why did you do that? Especially, another minor anecdote, when he was briefed as to his visits to Latin America, he's going to visit with Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he sees the briefer the next day and he goes, "Hey, Bob, I noticed that Mexico wasn't on that list." He goes, yes, sir, Mexico, it's just too hard. You know, they're prickly. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. He goes, "Okay, great. I'm going." And he decides to go. And when I ask him, well, why did you go? He's got this great Boston accent. He goes, "Christ, they're our neighbor. Like, of course I'm going to go. Why would I not go?" And yet no one else had ever done that. And a little known story is that in 2 years, between 92 and 94, General Sullivan visited Mexico not once, not twice, but 3 times before and after Los Zapatistas. And his counterpart visited the U.S. not once, not twice, but 3 times. 6 mutual visits in the course of 2 years. Hasn't happened before, hasn't happened since. And all kinds of stories that I could go into. But what I'm emphasizing here is the leadership, the decision to do this is what started to change. Again, pre-NAFTA signing. Sullivan says, well, you know, we're moving in the direction of NAFTA. Of course I'm going to go visit. Next slide. Oh, go back one. Can you go back? Okay, next one. I'm sorry. So this next slide is taken from the reviewing stand at Campo Militar Número 1, and it's a parade in honor of visiting Secretary of Defense William J. Perry in October of '95, the first visit by a sitting U.S. Defense Secretary. And after this, he goes in, and he goes extemporaneous because he said, "I've just witnessed the most spectacular display of military professionalism I think I've ever seen. You haven't lived if you haven't seen a company of Mexican Army nurses all in white, double timing past the reviewing stand. It's spectacular." Next slide. And so Secretary of Defense Perry and General Enrique Cervantes begin to establish this very positive relationship. The dashing young man to the right wearing the all-American patch is, again, the living fossil. I showed up in the office 2 weeks before Perry visits. Talk about just good timing and blind luck. And it's difficult to explain the quality of the rapport that the two, and neither one of them spoke the other's language. So either Gerardo Woolberg, the Mexican major, now Brigadier General, I believe, or is he? Whose English is better than mine, and won't say about how good his Spanish is. We were always there doing that, and there's just a wonderful relationship. And that, too, is a decision. The State Department recommended against it, and in fact, he demurred. He didn't go on the first time he planned to. But when General Cervantes went to General Sullivan's retirement, based on what General Diehr had said before, and he invited him, he accepted. And I have a hypothesis, and that is, it wasn't a random invitation, and he either was told by President Cedillo or asked permission to the president to extend the invitation. And it was another example of how, again, what's the context? NAFTA sign, Zapatistas, peso crisis, Clinton against the will of his Congress provides the loan's repaid. That's all going on. And so as Perez says, this is the, of the three pillars, political, diplomatic, economic, and security. The security was the third pillar of the stool, if you will, that needed to be implemented. And this is where that happens, or begins. Next slide. And of course, we had momentous elections in July of 2000. The Perez chokehold on political power. It goes to President Fox in the PAN. And prior to 9/11, there had been 4 visits, state-level visits. This is in San Cristobal de las Casas, of course, between the two presidents. And then, next slide, 9/11 happens and everything changes. Next slide. And because of 9/11, the U.S. for the first time creates a U.S. Northern Command and incorporates, prior to this, there are 3 countries that are unassigned to U.S. Geographic Combatant Command: Mexico, Canada, and the Soviet Union. And so as you create Northern Command, Mexico and Canada fall within the area of responsibility in terms of coordination to the Northern Command commander. But as Secretary Rumsfeld and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Richard Myers, unelegantly explained in this conference in 2002 when they're talking about the establishment of Northern Command, and say the commander of Northern Command will be responsible for all operations in North America, Canada, U.S., and Mexico. Next slide. And this gentleman by the name of General Vega Garcia says, au contraire, the only person in charge of operations in Mexico, c'est moi. And as long as, well, okay, so it's in Spanish, right? As long as I'm the Secretary of Defense, there will be no relationship with Northern Command. And there was not. The Navy, which has a very different relationship and has had historically with the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard, continued cooperating closely with the U.S., but the Army did not. That's not to say that the relationship was broken. Vega Garcia visited with the Secretary of Defense, with the chairman, but just not with this new entity called Northern Command. Next slide. And that continued throughout his tenure. President Calderon comes to office, and even prior to taking office, he has a meeting in November with President Bush, and Ambassador Tony Wayne could probably confirm this in a different way, but when I interviewed Ambassador Tony Garza about that, President Calderon says, "How do I talk to your president?" He said, "Well, my president's a very direct guy. You talk to him directly." I says, "Yeah, but give me the language." He says, "Well, when he's asking you what you, if you're in, say, yeah, are you in?" And he'll say, "I'm in." And he goes beyond that. After they do that, they say, "Are you in?" "Yes, I'm in." And President Bush asked President-elect Calderon, "So what do you need?" And President Calderon says, "Let me put it this way. If Jack Bauer's got it, I want it." So that's when we see this new phase, and we move beyond what we used to call security assistance to Mexico to security cooperation between the United States and Mexico. And just to put a fine point on it, prior to Secretary Perry's visit in '95, IMET, International Military and Education Training Funds for Mexico, was less than $100 $600,000 a year. Perry made the decision to increase it to $1 million. And so if we go from $1 million in 96, and then other sorts of funds begin to increase, salud, till I think in 2015, the latest data I have, all security cooperation funding is in the neighborhood of $15 million. That's not talking about FMS sales, just training. For a guy like me who grew up in Mexico, or spent time as an attaché, where you had to get approval from the Secretary of Defense for someone to visit your house, to this level of cooperation is truly astonishing. Next slide. And so we have a minor break. Perry retires. That great relationship they had established sort of goes away because General Cervantes doesn't have anybody to talk to. When Cohen comes in, he doesn't visit. Rumsfeld never visits. Fair enough, he's got 2 wars going on, but still, it's right next door. But he never does. But Secretary Gates visits not once, but twice. And at this one, it's the first time there is a combined meeting between the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the Mexican Secretary of Defense, and the Mexican Secretary of the Navy. You can see Admiral Salinas, and right next to him, General Galvan. And so the relationship, again, continues to move forward and strengthen. Next slide. I just like the picture. Next slide. And we have, for the first time in 2012, I believe, the first North American defense ministers meeting, where you have the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Hagel, his counterpart from Canada, is that McKay? And then General Cienfuegos and Admiral Sullivan. Next slide. Another not very well told story is the relationship that General Chuck Jacoby, the commander of Northern Command, establishes with his counterparts. A very quiet, unassuming gentleman who sort of under-promises and over-delivers. He had come on the heels of Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, who went on to be the vice chairman, who had improved relationships from those that had been in place under General Gene Renwart, Air Force 4-star. I won't talk about it, but there's a great little story in the book. Next slide. And so, the so what, right? So what? What do we care? This is the so what. To the extent that we collaborate in terms of intelligence sharing, training, and so forth, we're both more effective. And this is, of course, I think this is technically the 3rd time they actually grabbed Chapo, but who's counting? Next slide. And so that's former Chairman Marty Dempsey with General Cienfuegos and Admiral Sullivan at a meeting at actually the National Defense University in the War College's spaces. And another little known fact is there was a term of art called Dempsey's 6, where General Dempsey identified the top 6 countries in terms of priority. I won't mention the other 5. You can guess who they are. But one of those was Mexico. And just amazing, again, in terms of how far we have come in a relatively short period of time from a sort of the Heisman, a distant relationship, to one of exceptionally close coordination. Next slide. And I'll end there, but I can't help myself because Dr. Chavez Bill Chavez will talk about sort of the current state of affairs, but I just have to leave you with this slide to say that things are changing, but the defense to defense and the mill to mill relationship is holding despite the rhetoric. And I'll stop there and look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Craig. Really appreciate it. The historic context is so important, and I appreciate your summarizing it. Okay, we'll turn now to Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, who will kind of bring us up to today and talk about the most recent experience in the relationship.
Okay, thanks. Good morning. It's really wonderful to be here. And I'm looking forward to the dialogue after we all have our presentations. Craig, thank you so much for setting the stage. I do agree with your thesis that the mill-to-mill relationship is holding, but I don't think we should take it for granted. So I want to preface my comments with that statement. So I've been asked to focus my remarks on the 8 years of the Obama administration and how our defense relationship evolved during that period. And so I'm going to give you my view from my former perch as DASD, Western Hemisphere Affairs, under President Obama. So what I'm going to do first is talk about some of the concrete steps we took to advance our partnership, and then I want to highlight some concrete areas of cooperation. So in essence, what I want to do is talk about the relationship that President Trump inherited, and therefore what's at stake if there is to be a downturn in relations. Because we hear a lot about how the Trump administration's rhetoric and how the policy positions on the wall, on NAFTA and immigration, how they threaten economic, political, and even societal ties. But we don't hear as much about the potential impact on our security cooperation, our defense cooperation, which, as Craig pointed out, is a very important pillar of our broader bilateral relationship. And I do think this challenge is real. Mexico's heading into an election year. Anti-Trump sentiment continues to grow in Mexico, and that increased the political cost of partnering with the U.S. It's a reality. The Americas Barometer in 2017 came out with what I think is a very sobering statistic, that the distrust of the U.S. rose from 31% in Mexico. The distrust of the U.S. rose from 31% to 84% in the 3 months after the election. So we have a lot to lose. And Trump did inherit a relationship, I think, in the defense realm of unprecedented cooperation. So first, how did we get there? As Craig said, we've kind of gone through ebbs and flows. The mill-to-mill relationship has held very steady. But how over the 8 years of the Obama administration, what did we do? And both the United States and Mexico took steps, and it resulted in a transition of the strategic level defense relationship. And I saw determination on both sides, and will on both sides to strengthen ties. And a lot of this was about confidence-building measures to increase the trust. I mean, Craig mentioned since the very beginning there was this trust deficit. So, and also kind of, you mentioned Secretary Gates' advice that we have to kind of move at the speed of trust, that Mexico should have its foot on the gas pedal. We can't push too hard, too fast. But all of this, these gradual confidence building measures, they ultimately allowed us to really kind of roll up our sleeves and have the difficult and frank back and forth in forums such as the Defense Bilateral Working Group that allowed us to collaborate with Semar and Sedena, senior leadership, to develop long-term objectives, to set priority areas of engagement. And I think one of the major outcomes of this is that we traditionally have had a lot of cooperation in the area of counter-narcotics, but we moved beyond that narrow focus to talk about or to collaborate in when it comes to more traditional defense activities. Former Secretary of Defense Carter in 2016, he highlighted the advances, and in his words, he recognized that Mexico had expanded the traditional role as a regional defense leader and is becoming a global exporter of security across the hemisphere and across the world. And indeed, Mexico has demonstrated both the willingness and the capacity to take on a greater share of global and regional security burdens, not just in the Western Hemisphere. So some of the things that set the stage for this, Mexico launched its National Strategic Development Plan, designating, quote, a Mexico with global responsibilities and facing new global expectations. President Peña Nieto in 2014 announced his this foreign policy shift, and the Mexican military supported this shift. But I do want to point out here that it's worth noting that even before the Peña Nieto administration, Mexico already was an important regional defense leader, which did provide the Mexican defense institutions a very solid foundation on which to build. It's often overlooked that even before the shift, Mexico conducted approximately 40 external activities to support around 25 different partner nations, and this is in the 40 years leading up to the 2014 announcement of the shift. And the Mexican military continued to increase its activity in international fora, developing the groundwork for future external military missions, including contributions to United Nations peacekeeping operations. So now I want to talk about the specifics, what we were actually doing together, and therefore what we have to lose. And this gets to the so what question that you mentioned, Craig. And here I just want to say that it's the counter-narcotics, the Chapo example, these are very important, but our defense cooperation goes far beyond sort of the internal security. And we worked very closely with our counterparts in Mexico to develop shared objectives, and we basically placed them, new shared objectives, in two bins. One is regional security, and in this bin we have Central America working together to help the troubled nations, particularly of the Northern Triangle, and also the InterAmerican defense system. So that's one bin. The second bin is global responsibility. And again, this term is taken right out of the National Development Plan, Mexico's National Development Plan. And this is peacekeeping, and it's also humanitarian assistance and disaster relief coordination, cooperation. So I just want to go through these very quickly. And we can talk about them more in the Q&A if you're interested. So Central America. And I want to point out that our collaboration in Central America is very important to one of President Trump's priorities, stemming the flow of undocumented immigrants. And I think everyone in this audience knows that most of the migration into the United States is not actually from Mexico. It's from the Northern Triangle, from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And this is going to continue as long as those countries face the triple threat of poverty and inequality, weak government institutions, and massive public insecurity. So Mexico and the U.S., we started talking together about how we could address some of the root causes of migration in Central America. This included steps we could take to strengthen defense institutions in the Northern Triangle, increase military effectiveness, transparency and accountability of the defense ministries in this region. And this is especially important in Central America, where you have the military insertion into law enforcement. I mean, you mentioned this, Eric, when you talked about the internal security law in Mexico. It's a big issue in the Northern Triangle. I think a concrete example of Mexico's role is in April 2017, Mexico co-hosted the Central America, CENSEC, the Central America Security Conference, co-hosted it with U.S. Southcom and U.S. Northcom. And Mexico really took on a leadership role in this conference. They actually set the agenda. It was a really robust agenda. I think arguably more robust than past CENSECs, and I think this large part this was due to Mexico's leadership. Mexico also helps us with the dirty work of apprehensions. The 2014 unaccompanied children crisis would have been much worse without Mexico's assistance along the major smuggling routes. The Migration Policy Institute reports that Mexico is responsible for over 40% of apprehensions of those who are bound for the United States. So even with Mexico's help, we see that this is continuing. The flow continues, which underscores the need to focus on the roots of the problem rather than the symptom. Again, turning to the Americas Barometer, in 2017, the Americas Barometer reported that over half of those living in the Northern Triangle fear being victim of a homicide. And this very staggering statistics, I think it helps explain why the intention to migrate to the United States continues and why continued cooperation with Mexico is critical. And actually not just cooperation with Mexico, but cooperation with the entire community of Western Hemisphere nations. Second thing in this regional security bin is the Inter-American defense system. So like our efforts in Central America, Mexico and the United States, we have a shared interest in strengthening the Inter-American defense system. And this has provided opportunities for collaboration, to build mutual confidence, and to grow our defense partnership. And Mexico has really, really stepped up here. Mexico hosted the 2014 North American Defense Ministerial. The picture of Secretary Hagel, that was from that NATOM in Mexico City. Mexico is going to be hosting next year's Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas, which is also a very important conference, a very big deal for Mexico. Mexico has increased its presence in the Inter-American Defense Board from zero permanent staff in 2014 to about 20. And as Eric mentioned at the outset, Mexico is now the president, holds the presidency of the Inter-American Defense Board, and we're lucky to have the General Rodriguez Bucio here with us today. So that's, I'm going to stop there with the idea, so I'm running out of time, but so I want to turn now to the global responsibility bin. And here I want to highlight our nascent cooperation in humanitarian assistance, disaster response. And the importance of this cooperation has been highlighted by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And these environmental calamities represent another real challenge to stability and security in our region. And it's more urgent than ever as a result of climate change. The Mexican military is a leader when it comes to expertise and in the provision of technical assistance and know-how in disaster relief. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, Mexican soldiers provided potable water, hundreds of thousands of meals, and hundreds of medical consultations along our Gulf Coast. Before the Mexico City was hit by the 7.1 magnitude earthquake in September, Mexico was poised to provide important logistical support in Houston after Harvey. And as host of the 2018 Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas, Mexico is working closely with countries like Chile, Canada, and Trinidad and Tobago to develop a hemisphere-wide disaster relief policy. And the U.S., I think it's very important that we're a part of that effort. I do want to say a few words about counter-narcotics. I stress that we've broadened the aperture of our defense cooperation beyond counter-narcotics, but it remains very important. And it's particularly if we think about the Trump administration's rhetoric and policy positions, I think they're particularly puzzling because as with our migration cooperation, in jeopardizing counter-narcotics collaboration, President Trump risks cutting off his nose to spite his face. I mean, this is a policy priority for Trump. He's declared the opioid epidemic a public health emergency, and the U.S. supply-side approach requires Mexican assistance and collaboration. Over 90% of the heroin in the U.S. is either produced in or shipped through Mexico. Mexico is an important transit point for fentanyl, and it's the principal transit point for the cocaine entering the U.S. In Mexico, it's the military that has the drug enforcement mission, which includes fighting cartels and poppy eradication. So Mexico is a critical partner when it comes to the struggle against illicit trafficking. Craig, at the onset, talked about our shared history as something that we have to overcome, and an important factor to consider as we continue to mature our defense relationship. And the language, I would say the language coming out of the White House does not help when it comes to overcoming that history. I think it exacerbates a lot of the historical problems we've had. So my bottom line is, although the mill-to-mill relationship is held, as has been pointed out earlier, a deterioration in our defense cooperation, it threatens stability and security of our hemisphere in areas from illicit trafficking to migration and natural disaster-related humanitarian crises to destabilizing crime and violence. So I very much hope that Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson continue their outreach, but I would imagine that it sends a very confusing message to our partners in Mexico when you have messages at the level of the secretary sounding very different from the language that's coming from the president. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for reminding us of the various levels and kinds of cooperation beyond simply establishing a relationship that's important and what's potentially at risk here as we go forward. Appreciate that. Let's turn now to Gerardo Rodriguez Sanchez Lara from the University of the Americas in Puebla.
Thank you. Thanks to the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center for the invitation. It's an honor to be with Inigo Guevara. I think that he is the most important Mexican expert on Mexico's army institution here at DC. He is a hard power Mexican expert at Washington and also a colleague at the Heraldo de Mexico. They're Craig, the non-historian, most important expert on U.S. Mexico relations. Rebecca Bill, by far you are the most brilliant star of this panel, and we all recognize you, the historical responsibility you have at the DOD. So, and Eric also, I really appreciate the invitation. I make a small presentation, but that's my university, gorgeous at Puebla. Next one. Next one. Yeah, okay. So what we are seeing, maybe it's a change on Mexico's military doctrine. Maybe in like 10 years, apart from this moment, Craig can write about some change in the military doctrine. There's a lot more of internal security work in Mexico by the military police. That's the force that is right now helping the civilian forces and also the international security. This image, I would like to show it maybe 15 years ago when the IT crisis went into the desk of General Gerardo Clemente Garcia Vega and President Fox, and they didn't ask and they didn't respond for the asking for resources and Mexican U.S. UN peacekeeping operation to IT, to MINUSTA. Next. Well, in terms of the future of Mexico, Mexico is going to be the 7th economic power by 2050. It's a forecast by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Here's not Duncan, but and my colleagues also from the Canadian Institute. But Canada is going to be the 17th power, while Mexico is going to be the 7th economic power in 2050. And to be an economic power makes their responsibilities to be grown. Next one, please. Here is the national security budget evolution. We can see in the, we cannot see it clearly, but here is, I'm going to stand up. This is SEDEN increasing budget. So as you can see, from 2007 and 2014, the percentage of the increase of the military budget has been increasing vis-a-vis the other national security institutions. Next one. Well, we all know, and maybe in the book of Viridiana and Duncan and David, they can show these kind of problems. These are the structural problems of security in Mexico. Security system, judicial system, political impunity pact, the inequality and social economic vulnerabilities, and a relatively weak civil society on these matters of national security. Next one. This information was recently released by the National Police, and it is terrible. There's a 50% less capabilities of the local police forces that we need in Mexico. The local police that are within the governor's orders. Next one. So, we're here to talk about defense policies and U.S. Mexico relations. So imagine the relations that our Mexican military institutions have to deal with the Mexican security actors. We have dysfunctional actors at the security level, governors, and also at the federal government. There's also a black box inside the judicial branch. Until 3 years ago, we know that we have only 3.5 judges per 100,000 people. The average globally at our impunity index is 17. So Mexico has to make a great effort also in the judicial branch. The gangbang, the governors. This is the sexennium of the governors in jail. And also the kingpins, the organized crime, and what it is, I think it is the most important issue of this debate on the Internal Security Act debate is that we have the new kids on the block. The civil society in Mexico has, here is Maria Clara Costa, but in national security matters, there's a week of civil society actionism. Next one. Okay, so all these structural problems give us this bad image. Mexico is one of the 5th most impunity countries in the world. This is the global impunity index that we make it possible at the university. Next one. Next one. So, and this is one of the questions I was asked by Inigo before coming from Mexico City. And this is what I see is the silent transformation of Mexican military institution. At the domestic changes, we see the developing of the internal security concept, one concept that is being exported to Latin America, unfortunately. Strengthening the Army and Navy intelligence capabilities. As a professor at CESNAP and COLDEF and CEFA, I'm seeing an incredible evolution of the intelligence capabilities of our Mexican military institutions. And also what we have seen in the last years is that the Army and the Navy has been building an interdependency with some local governments because of their lack of commitment with the security issues. Bilateral U.S. Mexico. Mexico wants to be part of North American security agenda, no more a regional defense free rider. I was a student in a conference with professor of MIT, Michael Sapolsky, and he didn't know that he has a Mexican student right there. And Mike Sapolsky told Mexico is a free rider of the defense strategy of the United States since the Cold War. Yes, for sure. But right now, Mexico is no more a free rider. It's a strategic ally against terrorism and future threats, as also Rebecca reminded us. And it's also a consumer of U.S. Armament. It is really important. 2 years ago, and Inigo has the data, Mexico is buying helicopters, Mexico is buying missiles. It has been a great debate, but Mexico is a net consumer of U.S. armament. At the hemispheric issues, committed to be a leader on the defense hemispheric agenda, and also a global agenda leader. We have the first blue helmet from Mexico in Haiti, the Sahara, and Lebanon. And also we're participating in the special political mission in Colombia. Next. So I was also asked to have some remarks on the Internal Security Act. First, we have to remember that this was a political objective of the military institutions in order to achieve 2 points. Obtain resources from the public security budget, military police, to increase the actual state of force of 10,000 up to 50,000. Like, I think like in 3 to 4 years, maybe if the budget continues to be increased, maybe the military will have this state of force. Yes. We have a problem. Right now, Mexico has a pro-human rights constitution, and we have some clearly problems with the act in terms of transparency, use of force, and problems with our administrative law. Generals Cienfuegos and Sedena and the Navy make a political capitalization. It was a political motivation, and also they invest their personal and institutional political capital on the debate of the Internal Security Act. One really problem. Here in the U.S., in Washington, you have checks and balances. In Mexico, the national security institutions, they don't have a check and balance and no real accountability powers. We have also problems with the local governments, and also on internal security operations, there will be military command versus civilian command. That's something on the debate. Next one. My final remarks, Eric, I'm finishing. We are observing an unprecedented debate about the role of the armed forces in the interior. The armed forces are assuming a role as one of the political actors in the Mexican system. Traditionally, we saw the Mexican Army and the Navy be a part of the political activity, the political debate. No more. Mexico is a democracy, and the Mexican military institutions have to be part of this debate. The Mexican Army, yes, is polarizing public opinion around its public role and among the political elite. The Army and the Navy support the internal security law, not only for legal support interactions, but to increase their state of force and to strengthen their actions in intelligence matters. The armed forces will continue to support security matters due to the inability of local security institutions. That's a reality. And Mexico is in a security trap, as John Bailey told us 5 years ago, for the next 20 years. And here are two scenarios, two political scenarios. They are in the minds of Washington, DOD, the Eisenhower building, here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. What's going to pass if the Andrés Manuel López Obrador or the other opposition parties won the election about the U.S. Mexico relations on military issues? If an opposition candidate wins July's presidential election, they will win with a middle thirds of the vote. So will desperately need the support of the military establishment, so no change expected on internal security. And finally, the international agenda. I see if López Obrador wins, maybe the new international activism will decrease, as well as military purchase to the U.S. Thanks, Eric, Inigo, for the invitation.
Thank you. Appreciate that perspective from Mexico's side, and focusing on kind of also the changing role of the military within Mexico, which has been changing for some time, but it's important to be reminded of those dimensions. So thank you. Let's turn, last but not least, to what Gerardo called the #1 expert, Mexican expert on security relations in the United States.
Thank you, thank you.
And
I
Inigo,
realized,
thank you for your work on this issue. Go ahead.
Eric, thank you so much. I realized that now I need to write a lot of checks. Okay, so thank you, Eric, for this opportunity, and thank you, dear friends and experts, for coming together for this panel. I think it's shaping up quite nicely. Also like to thank Duncan Wood from the Mexico Institute, if he makes it out of the very cold north. Okay, so let's dive in. The Mexican Armed Forces' recent institutional developments and how the type of challenges that they're facing. So back in 2014, President Peña Nieto gave a speech at the UN in which he talked about, which he declared how Mexico will begin to support international peacekeeping operations. That was a turning point, a significant turning point for Mexico's foreign policy. And it was also a turning point for Mexico's military, because after 70 years of having mostly an internal focus, the Mexican armed forces are now suddenly tasked with developing an external footprint. So at that point, both Sedena and Semar set off to develop sort of a diplomatic infrastructure to increase their defense diplomacy activities abroad. And these have two shapes. One of the shapes are bilateral relations between Mexico and its most important partners, with its most important partner being the United States. I make a similarity between trade and defense cooperation, right? Even though the policy may be to have bilateral defense cooperation activities with most of the countries in the world, with most of the international community, the defense relationship from the U.S. Pulls it basically like a planet, like gravity, right? So we can expect that 80% or so, pretty much like the trade, like international trade does, of international defense cooperation to happen with the United States. So on that note, we have two very busy defense attaches in Washington, D.C., that have, over the past couple of years, been developing a series of relationships of connection points with the U.S. military at multiple connections. So on that end, that is something positive, because if you want to engage with another military, the U.S. military is probably the best established mindset-wise to connect with. It's probably the best force in the world that is predisposed to connect with other militaries. So this plug and play scenario really comes into place. So that is one aspect of it. The other aspect is that Mexico's military foreign policy, if we could call it that, is also struggling to maintain some sense of multilateralism, pretty much as with Mexico's foreign policy, which is very focused on multilateral agenda. The Mexican military shadows this and continues to do exactly the same. So we have Mexico taking up very important positions. General Luis Rodriguez Bucio, present with us today, became the president of the InterAmerican Defense Board, which is the longest standing multilateral military organization in the world, I believe, or at least in the Western Hemisphere. So we see that. So in this Mexican military outreach to the international community in multilateral organizations, we see that a lot of them are either U.S. based or U.S. supported. So that's also something interesting to consider, how Mexico takes up a key role as a pretty good functioning partner with the United States. And I stopped right there when I said partner, because I think that I'm trying to find the exact, we don't have an alliance per se, but I'd have to say more than neighbors, more than partners, definitely. So that's one part of the international development. The other part is that Mexico needs to develop a credible power projection capability in order to support its international outreach operations. So whether that be to send peacekeepers and to send peacekeepers beyond the observer status, because up to now, Mexico has contributed around 80 military personnel to different missions around the globe. Gerardo mentioned Haiti, Western Sahara, Lebanon, as well as the operation in Colombia. However, the Mexican military now is in the process of creating the first joint training center, which will be a peacekeeping center, training center in Mexico, which should be able to pump out a battalion-sized unit to begin to contributing with actual force to peacekeeping operations from around 2020. So that's definitely one part of it. And besides peacekeeping, the Mexican military is now faced with the need to invest quite significantly to develop its long-neglected and in some cases inexistent conventional military capabilities. So for the past, having spent most of the past 70 years focused on internal security, the Mexican military is mostly a light infantry force on the ground and a Coast Guard type of capabilities at sea. So at this point, Mexico does need to begin to modernize and in some cases create other capabilities, which in the majority of countries around the world are not a big issue, right? Last month, when the announcement that Mexico had procured 6 anti-ship missiles to arm one of its frigates, it suddenly became a crisis in Mexico's media. Oh my God, why is Mexico buying missiles? Well, it was frankly only buying 6 missiles to equip a frigate, which is scheduled to be launched in 2020. And the amount expended on it was, frankly, for us that deal with defense trade, quite insignificant. However, going ahead, Mexico will need to develop a strategic airlift capability to support its forces abroad. They will need to also modernize its combat capability, even if it's just a minor token conventional capability, such as a fighter aircraft capability, armor, and artillery, which are, frankly, I don't think that the word obsolete comes into there fairly. In most cases, they are actually museum pieces. So there needs to be a lot of investment there. What we have seen in the past couple of years is that Mexico evolved from being a military aid recipient to becoming a paying customer. So that is also significant. While defense spending has increased in nominal terms, and here I'll have a minor disagreement with my friend Gerardo, even though you spoke so highly of me. The way that we compare defense spending around the globe is creating an index based on the country's GDP, right? So global GDP, global defense expenditure in GDP is about 2%. For the U.S., that's about 3.4% of its GDP. In Latin America, the average is about 1.2%. So most Latin American countries spend around 1.2% of their GDP on defense, and most Latin American countries have a separate internal security force, which usually reports to a Ministry of Interior, with its armed forces focusing on purely defense matters. However, in the case of Mexico, and this we can trace back to the 1960s, defense spending has not gone over 0.6%. So in a couple of years, we've seen it spike up to 0.7%. But in general terms, Mexico devotes a very poor amount of funding for its military forces. Thank you. So that is basically wrapping on Mexico's external capabilities. If it is to invest, the amount of funding to get it to about 1%, the economic, there could definitely be some positive economic outcome out of it if Mexico decides to employ a modern style of procurement. I'm going to go just 1 minute more. I'm going to talk about the internal security forces briefly, with a deficit of Mexican police, which is about 300,000. Mexico needs about an additional 300,000 police at the municipal, state, and federal level. And here we're just talking numbers. We're not even talking quality. The military's role, which was a subsidiary one, and which was to be a temporary support, has now longed for over 12 years, to the point that the Mexican military sees that there hasn't been any advances, any real advances in the police sector. Besides the federal police having increased, last 6 years have been stagnated. The state police, we saw the point at which they were. So the Mexican army is setting up the military police, and the military police is being regular troops that are being retrained in human rights, in legal, the standard legal processes, due processes, etc. We can go into it. You should definitely go into it in the paper. At the same point that the Mexican Navy is setting up a Coast Guard. It's setting up a Coast Guard, and it's now become the national maritime authority, which means that the Mexican Navy is in control of Mexico's 119 ports. This is the same model that the U.S. Coast Guard uses in the States and that multiple countries use around the world. So we can see how internal security has a very direct effect on U.S. national security. So maintaining this military-to-military relationship is frankly in the best interest of both countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inigo. And yes, let me just again commend to you Inigo's paper that delves into some of the issues he's highlighted here, building a blue water capacity within the Navy, force projection capacity going forward, and also this issue of the development of the military police. I think it's very significant development. Craig, you started us off. So you've been very patient listening to everybody. I want to give you a chance to respond in any way. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I just wanted to give you that chance, and then I'm going to open it up to questions here from the audience. So,
just 3 quick points that, if I may.
I could tell you were thinking about some important points.
But so Rebecca mentioned the existence of these bilateral working groups. Secretary Perry had this model in his mind. He had started with the Partners for Peace in Europe, but he implemented the first Latin American bilateral working group in 1995, and it went moribund for a while. But then I believe it was did Frank bring it?
Yep.
Frank Mora, Rebecca's predecessor, brought it back to life. So again, that goes back to Perry's visit. And another thing that Rebecca mentioned that popped in my mind, the impressive continuity that we saw between both administrations. We all are aware that when Bush transferred to Obama, President Obama changed a number of policies around the world. But one of the things he maintained was the security relationship with Mexico. They thought about calling it Merida 2.0 or Beyond Merida, but they didn't. They did change the focus a little bit, but there was great continuity, and perhaps even more impressively was from Calderon back to Peña Nieto, so from PAN to the PRI, and despite an initial yikes, se metieron hasta la cocina, you know, well, these guys are everywhere. After a couple of months, like, yeah, but that collaboration is very helpful, and so that too continued. And then just to the final point, you mentioned tweets. My first week in the job, when we were waiting for President Peña Nieto to come the following Tuesday, and then the tweet, well, maybe he shouldn't come if he's not going to pay for the wall, and then the phone call the next day. I had lots of perfectly blonde hair on Thursday, and then Friday I woke up like this. And they canceled. There was a previously established or scheduled meeting between General Cienfuegos and Admiral Soberon to come up and visit with Secretary Mattis, and they canceled that. But the good news is it got back on track, and the cherry on top of the cream, icing on the cake, whatever, is that for the first time, Secretary Mattis went to this year's Independence Day celebrations. He was there for Grito, the first time a U.S. Secretary of Defense has ever been there. So just to reinforce the fact that the defense-to-defense, the mill-to-mill relationship is stronger than it's ever been despite all this. So it's a good news story. We can't be complacent. Couldn't agree more. Thanks.
Let me ask one more question on that just before we turn it over, and I'll insist on pretty brief responses. But both Rebecca and Craig have mentioned that we can't be complacent, that things could fall, that you know, this could be difficult, especially in the current context of anti-immigrant sentiment and the wall, et cetera, all the things we know. I guess I wanted to ask the Mexicans on the panel, Inigo and Gerardo, the same sort of question. From the Mexican perspective, you know, you're going into a presidential election. Is the same thing possible? Are there risks to the relationship as that campaign goes on and as we see the results? And I'm not asking you to handicap who is going to win the presidency, but could you just say, you know, is this the case on the Mexican side as well?
Well,
you want to pass the hot potato somewhere else, or?
Well, I put it on my presentation, the risk on the relation. I think the huge relation is some kind of structurally interdependence between U.S. and Mexico. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of changes. Maybe Andrés Manuel is going to sell the new presidential airplane. He has also said that he's going to disappear our Secret Service, the Estado Mayor Presidencial. He has also said that he's going to make a National Guard, not the National Guard that you understand here in the U.S. and also in Mexico, kind of coordination between the military and civilian forces. So the Navy and the Army will still continue to be in public security matters. So it is not going to change. What I think is going to change is that maybe they're not going to buy so many helicopters or so many missiles, 6 missiles to the Navy. So I think that purchase have to be done in this last year of President Peña Nieto, because I don't think that Andrés Manuel has the political will to continue that consuming of armament. So I don't think that the relation is on stake because of what people like Rebecca and Craig in your moment, what Steve Bannon told us about the deep state. There's a deep state inside the Department of State and the DOD that are making this relation work day by day. And this, I finish, Eric. We are in the highest level of military cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico ever. So I would like it to continue. I think that the next president will have to take that into account.
Okay. Briefly?
Yes, definitely. I just have to say that as long as the rhetoric is one-sided, it gets lost in the noise.
Mm. Rebecca, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to, the importance of Mattis's visit to Greedo, I think that was very important. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that it was just as Mattis was landing in Mexico City that the news broke in the Mexican press that coming out of the White House was language that Mexico was similar to Venezuela, that it was, this whole failed narco state language. So you have, yes, you do have a SecDef going to Greedo, but you have him arriving at the same time this rhetoric is coming out of D.C., which I think immediately put Secretary Mattis in the very unfortunate position of having to go into damage control. And I mean, I would imagine that it kind of hindered his effectiveness.
Great. All right. I'll take 3 questions. Please make them brief so that we have time. There's one all the way in the back there. I'll take one here from Mike and the gentleman here. And I'll come back to you, Evan, if I have an additional time. Please use the mic. We'll start in the back. Identify yourself. Use the mic because people are listening online.
Hi, my name is Kirk Schur with Clearview Strategy Group. My question has both a policy and practical implication. The military has now the Policía Militar with certain functions internally. At the same time, the police have created the Policía Militarizada. Could you talk about that from both a policy and a practical perspective? Because it seems pretty confusing on the ground.
Right. Mike?
Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. There's one contradiction. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something. You say there's a fierce internal debate in Mexico about the internal security law, but at the same time, even if AMLO wins, he's not going to change the role of the Army in internal security. If that's the case, what's the purpose of the debate?
Exactly. Thank you.
There we go. There was a question right here with this young gentleman.
Thank you. I'm Andreas Ross with the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I wanted to ask about counter-narcotics. Now, you mentioned or referenced the Wall project sort of as the rhetoric that doesn't help the Americans' case. However, is there any middle ground? Is there anything in terms of border security that can be done? There's a number of $25 million at play now, it seems. What are the border security measures that, in terms of counter-narcotics, would actually make a difference?
Hand it to Evan. We'll hold Evan until the next round. So got 3 questions. I'll let you all pick and choose, and let's try to keep it brief so we can get in another round.
Thank you. For the gentleman in the back, Mr. Kirk, I'm sorry, I haven't heard anything about the Policía Militarizada. So if
you mean like the gendarmerie? Is that what you?
No, in a country in Guerrero, you see police with uniforms that say Policía Militarizada.
Militarizada? Oh, Policía Militar. Yes, so Policía Militar is this expanded role that the traditional military police has been assigned. The traditional military police in charge of policing the military itself now has a...
I don't know.
I'm sorry, no. There's a gendarmerie that was set up, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So I'll be glad to look into it if we can talk afterwards. On the internal security debate, why will it be a debate? Thank you. That's it. And sir, on the specific border measures that could take place to significantly improve counter-narcotics, I think that the next stage for Mexico's infrastructure development or security infrastructure development will be to set up a radar network in the north of the country. That's been in plan since 2015, has not been yet implemented, but radars in that region would significantly help curb the number of illegal flights coming into Mexico, as well as coming out of Mexico. So that would definitely be something to look into.
Another?
I deeply agree with my friend Inigo, and also I can make a remark. Also, the radar system, and also maybe Mexico has to increase its national security satellites system. So in order to control the production of amapola, cocaine, marijuana, maybe that will be something interesting. I also agree. Andrés Manuel López Obrador has also said that he has not problem with the Internal Security Act, although their party has blocked or tried to block with other political parties, opposition parties, it in the Congress. But I think that Andrés Manuel is going to continue to use the military, and not necessarily with a declaration of internal security.
Rebecca?
This probably seems very obvious, but I think that the internal security lie, I mean, I think that as someone looking in and looking at other countries in the region that have come to rely so heavily on their military for law enforcement, it's just that by passing the law, it takes away any incentive, or the concern that it could take away incentives to strengthen the gendarmerie and the police by institutionalizing this role. So yes, there is the reality that you mentioned. I think both of you actually mentioned the reality is that the police isn't up to this task, but if you have it institutionalized, you know, what is the incentive to actually strengthen the police?
Yeah. I want to hopefully, you know, either Marie Claire or Viridiana Rios or others in other panels will address this point. It's a good question. I would just say that it is it's a profound change in Mexico. Regardless of what Andrés Manuel may say or anybody else, it would be akin to changing posse comitatus in this country, to legalize and open up a space. The politicians may all agree, but there would be questions. What is the appropriate role of the military in public security? And that's why it's controversial. Again, people have very different points of view. I'm sure Marie Claire has a terrific explanation here. I'll call on her and Evan and Dolia, and then I'm sorry I'm going to have to close it down because we want to leave space. So, Evan, go ahead. Evan Ellis.
Yes. Evan Ellis at U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. First of all, thank you. Excellent panel, all four of our experts here. So many questions, but if I could, I'll abuse my privilege just for our American colleagues and North American colleagues on the panel.
We're all North American.
We're all North American. I'm sorry.
We're all North American.
Come on, Evan, man, get your head.
Our U.S. colleagues, what in your non-governmental opinion, should be the U.S. role towards the new internal security law? You know, this has been a very important policy consideration in terms of our attitude towards many of our partner nations in the region of how do we engage with military in the internal security role? What should that be? And then for Inigo, particularly, and actually both of our Mexican colleagues, there's been any comments, if possible, on the status of a few of these new important activities, the transition taking over port security from SCT. What is the status of the gendarme, which seems to have been ambiguous in the way it's being implemented, and if any information about the work of Susten in creating these new systems of integration, both on the Marina side and the Salinas side. Thank you very much.
Would you pass the mic to Marie Claire right in front of you? In front of you? Sorry, just.
Thank you.
Marie Claire Acosta, who will be our keynote speaker in a minute, but go ahead.
Okay.
I know this is an issue you're interested in.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to ask a question. Aside from everything that has been said about the impact of the internal security law, I think that there is a consensus in Mexico, at least civil society, that an internal security law was needed. I mean, it's obvious that you cannot have the military providing internal security without a legal framework or an adequate legal framework. But my question is, why does it go so directly against the Constitution in certain aspects? The National Human Rights Commission has challenged it on constitutional grounds. It's in the Supreme Court right now. The UN was very worried about it, the InterAmerican Human Rights Commission. So that's my question. Could it not have been the legal framework that is needed, but why challenge rights that have cost so much to achieve?
Okay, and there was a question right over here with Dolia. She's got the microphone, Dolia. The mic doesn't seem to be on. I don't know.
My name is Dolia Esteves, and I'm a journalist. And my question has to do with something that Marie Claire just mentioned, and is addressed to Rebecca Bill Chavez and to Craig Diehr, and that has to do with the human rights issue with the military. I just wonder, those 8 years that you were with the Obama administration, if the issue of human rights violation by the military, and this has been documented in many episodes, some of them very horrible episodes in Mexico, ever came up. Did it ever, was it ever a concern to go forward in this cooperation, military cooperation that you so eloquently described? I mean, it's like the elephant in the room for many people, particularly in Mexico, and a lot of people here, NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolia. Okay, so some important issues. I can go up and down the line, or somebody can volunteer to go first. Rebecca, you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you for those questions. And I as far as, Evan, your question, and I think the three questions are very much linked, and I'll look forward to hearing your perspective as well as the Mexican perspective, as well as Craig's perspective on this. As far as our response to your specific question, Evan, about the U.S. response, I think we should not be silent about it. I think we should express our concern. We're not silent. I mean, this is not an issue that's unique to Mexico. I think for example, President Obama when we came up with the Central America strategy, and it came to assistance to the countries of the Northern Triangle, a big impediment, and we were very limited in the assistance we could provide because of the military's role in law enforcement. I mean, it is a concern, and I can't provide the Mexican point of view, but I agree, this notion of a legal framework makes sense, but why this particular version, right? Especially for the reasons that I expressed about the disincentive to strengthen the police. And to your question, yes, human rights weighed heavily on us. It's something that came up, I would say, on a daily basis. And I'm happy to talk to you about this offline. But we can talk about the Leahy process. I think is probably the most tangible way that lens to look at this issue through. I think one important step that we made was in the Leahy remediation process. We Mexico was actually the first case where there was a remediation case, and I think a lot of that had to do with the transparency in that particular case where there were gross violations of human rights by the Mexican military. But why don't we talk about that offline, because it's a very big issue, and it is something that weighed very heavily on us, not just in Mexico, but throughout the entire region.
I don't want to cut anybody off, but Gerardo, do you have anything you want to contribute?
Yeah, for sure. To Marie Claire Acosta PhD question, it was for a PhD thesis. The original redaction of the Internal Security Act, the one presented by a Congressman Cesar Camacho, I have some remarks, some information that it was clearly in touch with the Defense Ministry interests. So I think it was a really tough redaction. It has. I was asked by the National Security Council to make my remarks before it passed to the Senate, and I made 22 recommendations to change to the original redaction that was passed in the Mexican Congress and passed to the Senate. So if we made 20 changes to the National Security Act of 2005, and that act passed unanimously by all political parties. I don't understand why the closed mind of the Mexican government to pass it as it was. Maybe it will, and for me, it's shaming that the Army and the Navy needs a law for the internal security actions, but not this law. Maybe they'll have to make some changes and more time to the redaction. And a final remark, Eric. In Mexico, we have only 26,000 federal police for a country of 120 million people. So what we have to increase is not the military police. Sorry to my friends in the Army and the Navy. What we have to increase is the Mexican National Police.
Thank you. Craig, any parting thoughts here?
It's a really tough issue, and the perspective I bring to it is a hypersensitivity of what you say in public, and with our historical concerns of sovereignty. I think one of the things I would be very leery of is giving my counsel in public. I would do so in private, and I would hope that our interagency would meet in private and have those conversations in private. But at the end of the day, Mexico is sovereign to take whatever decisions it wants, and we have to acknowledge that. And if we're not, then here we are again. And even if we're right, sticking our nose into a foreign country's business is something that I'm hypersensitive to. So that's all I'll say.
Inigo?
Thank you. Marie Claire, as to the internal security law, I think that it has some positives. It establishes a framework for the military to go into a state, operate there, and then leave. And it requires local government consent to do that, and a mechanism by which they are requesting. However, I also feel that it has several negatives. And some of those include the lack of transparency, the lack of oversight mechanisms for that. I can understand why they're there, because when we look at who would be providing the oversight, I would not have any confidence in them. That does not mean that a law needs to be written for the people that are in power at this point. And unfortunately, that trumps the rest of the law. Oops. Excuse the pump. Excuse the...
Thank you all very much. We're going to shift really quickly into our keynote address. We'll break for coffee afterwards, so hang in there just another 30 minutes or so. Please join me in thanking our panel. Obviously, we just scratched the surface here, but we appreciate all your involvement. Let me just say once again, we're delighted to have Maria Clara Costa with us, a citizen, member of the Citizen Participation Committee at the Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción, the National Anti-Corruption System in Mexico. And as I understand it, Maria Clara will be assuming the presidency of the anti-corruption system later this week. It's a rotating presidency for 1 year of service or servitude, however you want to talk about it. But we are delighted to have her and congratulate her on her role there. We invited Maria Clara to speak this morning out of recognition for the saliency of corruption and anti-corruption efforts in Mexico and the political debate there. The political landscape in Mexico has been rocked by front-page stories about corruption at every level of government. I think I mentioned in my opening remarks that as many as 14 current and former governors are under investigation, but it's not limited to governors, municipal level, federal level, even at the presidential level. The lack of strong governance is probably among Mexico's biggest challenges today and is becoming a leading issue in the presidential campaign. Our keynote address today is apropos to this challenge and is entitled Fighting Corruption and the Unrule of Law in Mexico. We'll dig into this topic further in the next panel after coffee break, but we wanted to look much more closely at this issue and invited Maria Clara to speak on it. Corruption is no longer viewed solely as a moral issue, the failing of an individual, but has rather become a question of rule of law that must be addressed from a rule of law perspective, one that makes anti-corruption efforts rule of law and ultimately the struggle for human rights, the central challenge for strengthening democracy in Mexico. And that's why Maria Clara's voice is so important. I don't want to go into detail on her bio, it's in the back, but let me just highlight a couple of things that are relevant to this issue today. She is one of the founders and architects of Mexico's non-governmental human rights network and movement. She was a leader originally in the Mexican Academy for Human Rights and then founder of one of Mexico's most important governmental organizations, the Commission for the Promotion and Defense of Human Rights in Mexico. But she was not only in the non-governmental sector. She became President Fox's Undersecretary for Human Rights and Democracy and the Mexico's Ambassador for Human Rights during the 2000s. She also worked at the OAS, the Organization of American States, as the Director of the Office on Promotion of Good Governance, where human rights was understood in a broader context than simply the legal questions. And then she was also in charge of Freedom House's program for creating a human rights protection mechanism in Mexico. So let me stop there and invite Maria Clara to come forward. I'll ask her a couple questions at the end, and you all can chime in as well. But we are delighted to bring you here to Washington and have you give our keynote address today on a pressing and important issue. Thank you.
Well, good morning to you all, and thank you very much, Eric, for this presentation and for the invitation to be here. This is really an honor to be able to share some thoughts with you about this great, terrible issue, which is corruption in Mexico. I wrote a few pages that I'm not going to read. I'm going to try to give you the salient points of what I have to say, but if you want to grab a piece of paper and read it later, I think there's still some out there.
We'll
Well,
post it online as well.
Okay, good. Well, as Eric said, corruption and impunity have become central issues in the current public debate in Mexico. And as he said again, this is the result of a recent chain of events and public scandals that go back at least to the abduction and disappearance of 43 students in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero, in Iguala. It's called the Ayotzinapa case. But then it was followed, which was a shocking and terrible event, by a journalistic investigation of alleged payments of favors from a private contractor to President Peña Nieto in the form of a mansion, a very luxurious and beautiful mansion in Mexico City, the infamous Casa Blanca. And then it was followed by the journalist in charge of this investigation was fired eventually from her position in the broadcasting corporation. But so this sort of sparked the revelation of a series of scandals relating to corruption, and then of course the gubernatorial races of 2016, in which the PRI lost about 9 governments, opened up a whole chapter about the embezzlement of public funds by a number of former state governors. There are 11 former state governors being investigated or in prison for this embezzlement of public funds and very complicated schemes to finance elections, et cetera. And then, of course, practically every week in the news, you hear of a faulty freeway that caused casualties. Then, of course, we had 2 earthquakes, and there was very terrible incidents of children being killed as a consequence of unsafe buildings. And even leading up to the use of a state prison in Coahuila as a headquarters for the Zeta cartel that has just recently also been researched and revealed. So these are just samples of what the public has recently learned about how corruption operates in Mexico. And of course, the latest event to rock the political system is the judicial investigation in Chihuahua of a network of corrupt federal and state officials charged with funneling public funds that were originally destined for education and other public services to electoral campaigns in several states of the Republic. And unfortunately, the Treasury, the Secretaría de Hacienda, would appear to be directly implicated in this network. So corruption but of course corruption is not new in Mexico. It's a well-known fact, but it certainly has been dominant in the public debate in the last years. And, of course, it's endemic and systemic and has long been the case. It's a surprise to no one here. And it's reiterated by every existing measurement on corruption, be it national or international. But what is new and encouraging is that it has become a prime issue relevant in the public sphere. And it is central to the warming electoral season with possibly game-changing results in July of this year, as we heard in the previous panel. So obviously, and Eric mentioned it, corruption and the de facto impunity enjoyed by its perpetrators cause huge damage and many, many victims. It is, in short, a key and defining component of the current security crisis in which Mexico has been engulfed in a crescendoing fashion during the past decade. It also lies very close to the complex situation defined by widespread and grave human rights abuse and the attendant virtual collapse of the criminal justice system. And according to some estimates, it costs Mexico about 10% of its gross domestic product. and is obviously a major factor in the weak rate of economic growth. But it also has affected and distorted and thwarted our democratic development, and naturally producing a widespread lack of trust and confidence in government institutions at the national, state, and municipal levels. And this lack of trust has been recognized by institutions such as the Instituto Nacional Electoral. So none of this is new. So what makes it such a salient issue today? Well, many things. Obviously, there's an accumulation of grievances, frustration, and suffering caused by the causes of corruption, by the practices of corruption, and this cannot be underestimated. But there is something new, and that is the mobilization of civil society, including around the issue of corruption, a thriving, if nascent, partnership with business leaders to bring the anti-corruption agenda to prominence. And I think this is a quite remarkable event. Now, just a few historical antecedents. If you remember, the Peña Nieto, after winning the election, appropriated a platform of reforms, the Pacto por México. We all know about the Pacto por México. And it included, the Pacto, the need for a creation of a national anti-corruption system. So there was the beginning of a debate on how to incorporate an anti-corruption system into the laws in Mexico. And in fact, a lot of these initiatives were built on or based on legal reforms and public policy initiatives of the previous administration. So Peña Nieto developed an initiative and that it would establish a national anti-corruption commission, Comisión Nacional Anticorrupción, that would be under his wing. And it would be partnered by a National Council for Public Ethics, Consejo Nacional para la Ética Pública, which was to include some civil society participation. Neither one of these came into being. Both these initiatives were met with great criticism, especially after the wounding of the presidency resulting from the Ayotzinapa and Casablanca episodes, which were stained by cover-ups. So finally, with input from civil society and business organizations who joined forces, the Senate enacted a constitutional reform. On May the 17th to 15, the present national anti-corruption system came into being and gained its enabling legislation a year later in 2016. So the Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción was officially installed in mid-2017, and its goal is to prevent, detect, investigate, and punish acts of corruption, including administrative offenses, as well as to strengthen the institutions charged with this task in the three branches of government. Very ambitious. Its institutional design is very complex. It is a state institution, but it's operated by government, the government, but with direct civil society participation in its management, hence the Comité de Participación Ciudadana. And its principal component is a coordinating committee in which several agencies and a just newly created administrative court join efforts in order to develop instruments and policies designed to deter and punish corruption. So as I said before, it's presided by the Citizens Committee, Comité de Participación Ciudadana, which I will preside at the end of this week. And this, I would say, is the most salient and original feature of the system. These members, these citizens, are chosen by a committee of intersectoral leaders from academia, business, and civil society, Viridiana being a member of that committee, with a senatorial mandate. And the CPC is charged with ensuring that the system functions correctly, with recommendations carried out, and it has the power to introduce issues regarding corruption to the coordinating committee and to propose the main tenets of a national anti-corruption policy and the instruments with which to measure its enforcement. Okay, according to the law, the Ley General del Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción, the whole system, including the local level mirroring replicas of it in the 32 states, were to have been up and running by mid-July in 2017. This did not happen. And I fault, foremost, a political will with very weak resolve. So with meager results to date, this political will must be created and is one of the major tasks facing the Comité de Participación Ciudadana. Needless to say, the Sistema is still finding its footing in an incredibly complex and difficult environment. And I note that the complexity of the design, because it includes multiple agencies and it also is replicated at every state, produces, in theory, desirable checks and balances in the implementation of reforms and in the performance of the global system, but is incredibly, incredibly difficult to implement. So having been a member of the Citizens Committee for a year, I can and would like to speak briefly about some of the enormous obstacles that the system faces. It was created under the assumption that there existed and exists a real and serious intention to deal with corruption in a decisive and effective manner. And this is an illusion. Corruption and impunity are built into the governing system in Mexico and appear to be ingrained in its political class. So we sense in the system a deep ambivalence in the political will. For instance, appointments and nominations of key actors here, such as the 18 magistrates of the newly created administrative court, were done in a business-as-usual manner, in which political quotas and favors were hardly absent in were hardly absent in an opening gambit to institute real reform. So one of the first activities of the Citizens Commission was to request the Senate to hold off their ratification until the President's office could clarify the criteria that had been used in nominating them. The result was a rebuff by the Senate committee charged with the task, and followed a few weeks later by a media attack on the system as a whole. Another, for instance, formidable obstacle is the integration of these local sistemas locales anticorrupción. Up to date, only about half of these 32 state-level anti-corruption platforms have been placed. And their implementation has been lamentably subjected to manipulation by state governments and other powers that be, state congresses, etc. So this led us, again, the Citizens Committee of the system at the national level, to file a class action suit last August on the grounds that the implementation of the local systems had deviated and were deviating from the constitutional mandate. The suit was admitted, and we are awaiting the court's resolution for the moment. But there are other sort of less evident but equally important problems in the design of the system itself. Jacqueline Pechard, the outgoing president of the coordinating committee, referred to one of them in her last public address to this body. And she asked, how can 6 different agencies pertaining to the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of power, as well as an autonomous body, coordinate their efforts smoothly if they differ so much in their regulations, agendas, and priorities? This is a very serious obstacle and will become even more serious if it is not dealt with soon enough. And added to this is the glaring omission of 3 key pieces of the coordinating committee, whose appointments are still missing. These are the newly created Special Prosecutor for Anti-Corruption, Fiscalía Anticorrupción, the 18 magistrates that I referred to, and the Auditor Superior de la Federación, the Superior Audit Office of the Federation, whose term expired at the end of 2017. And without these essential actors, needless to say, the system is crippled, and it cannot carry out one of its basic mandates, which is the effective investigation and punishment of acts of corruption. Well, as we all know, Mexico is entering a very difficult difficult electoral year. More than 3,000 positions are up for election at the federal, state, and municipal level. This is a result of the political reform enacted under the Pacto por México. And the competition promises to be fierce, even vicious, and polarization has already set in. So this makes agreeing on nominations a virtually impossible task. The political consensus of the first years of the Peña Nieto administration has been broken. And all of these scandals have created a situation where dealing with such inflammable and potentially dangerous issues as the proven existence of corruption networks that interfere in electoral processes, the embezzlement and misuse of public funds, and the penetration of state institutions by organized crime, among others, make it very difficult to reach a consensus. But however, the appointment of the new head of the Superior Audit Office is of the utmost importance, and that responsibility is in the Chamber of Deputies. And so far, none of the candidates have proven to be wholly suitable, and this is a situation with potentially serious consequences for the system. On the other hand, the appointment of the special prosecutor, Fiscal Anticorrupción, the other missing piece of the system, is embroiled in a larger and more defining dilemma, which is the creation of a truly independent, autonomous, and professional general prosecutor, Fiscalía General in Mexico. And until this is resolved, any attempt to fight corruption effectively will be hampered by political pressures and complicities of all sorts. And the recent evaluation of the measures undertaken by Mexico against money laundering and financing of terrorism by the Financial Action Task Force is just a very eloquent example of the poor performance of government agencies, especially the PGR, in this highly sensitive matter. So if we do not refashion the Procuraduría General de la República and replace that institution, which is an institution dating from the authoritarian past of Mexico, which is not going away quickly, but anyway, but it has to be replaced by an independent general prosecutor. And there was a reform in 2014 that mandated this, but it was an incomplete and nominal reform, and it left the body of the Procuraduría virtually intact. So its institutional design as it stands today is being very seriously challenged. I won't go into the details, but there was even a clause, a transitory clause, that allowed for its incumbent, appointed directly by the president with senatorial ratification, to continue in the position. And this prompted the same civil society coalition that promoted the creation of the Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción, which is a very interesting event, to join forces with human rights and victims organizations, as well as organized business, in a coalition under the names of Vamos por una Fiscalía que Sirva and Aquí y Ahora. And this coalition has been successful in overturning the automatic transfer of the incumbent to the new arrangement, and is now demanding a complete constitutional reform with a total makeover of the Fiscalía General, in order to produce a modern, professional, independent, and autonomous body. This means deferring the appointment of a special prosecutor for anti-corruption, who in any case, even if that special prosecutor were appointed today, would only have a few months to work. But of course,
the possibility of this constitutional reform in an electoral year, such as the one we're facing, does not look too promising. But it is certainly desirable. So as we all know, the latest results of the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index for 2017 gave Mexico a very low ranking, 0.45, where 1 represents a greater adherence to the rule of law. The score is lower than those of Sri Lanka, Lebanon, and the Philippines, lower than the score of El Salvador, and actually close to the bottom of the Latin American region. And as we know, the score covers indicators on constraints on governmental powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, order and security, regulatory enforcement, and civil and civil and criminal justice. So Mexico scored, of all these indicators, it scored lowest in the criminal justice one and on the one on absence of corruption, particularly regarding the effectiveness of the correctional system and the absence of corruption in the legislature. So all of this is very discouraging for the Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción. The results of the project point to the evident truth that corruption cannot be tackled effectively in an environment where the rule of law is so weak. And controlling corruption, as we have learned, and as the system is made to, requires a holistic approach. And without a fully independent and professional Fiscalía General, any attempt to do so is an illusion. So thus, the next step that the Comité de Participación Ciudadana needs to take, and this is my personal position, is to support the efforts of the Aquí y Ahora coalition. An independent and professional Fiscalía General is the key to any serious attempt to fight corruption and establish the rule of law. And without that, it will be virtually impossible to do so. And I would like to make 3 concluding points. First, the Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción is an urgently needed and long-term project that implies a transformation of state and society. The failure of the anti-corruption program indeed would imply conditions threatening my nation's security. Its complex design reflects the ambitiousness of confronting a systemic and endemic phenomenon. And I may add, it has not failed yet, despite some early reports of demise by some opinion makers, including the New York Times. Second, the fact that the Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción has succeeded in integrating civil society into its structure and provided it with a leadership role is its unique and redeeming feature. The Comité de Participación Ciudadana needs to take advantage of this position to the utmost. It must increase and broaden its citizen base and its relationship with all sectors of civil society. It has to branch out and reach out to the human rights, civil society organizations, to victims' organizations, to environmentalists. It has to break away from the very, I would say, professional and knowledgeable civil society organizations that work wholly on governance issues and reach out and broaden its citizen space in order to build the rule of law that the country so badly needs. And third, in this particular moment, heading toward the crucial elections in July of this year, the Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción is at once empowered by the embrace of anti-corruption rhetoric by all political parties, because all political parties have begun now to espouse their positions on anti-corruption. And of course, we must be extra vigilant to avoid partisan politicization. But we only have to listen. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to understand very clearly is that we work on principles. We don't take stand with political parties. And in fact, we only have to listen to the underlying cry of protest from the citizenry of Mexico. So thank you very much. I hope that this...
Kind of a little disheartening, Marie Claire, but you did save it there at the end with a few positives, things that could come from this experience. We have just a very few minutes here. If there are a couple of questions from the audience. Maureen Meyer has a question. Anyone on this back right-hand side I missed last time? All right, Maureen, go ahead, and I'll take one other one if it's quick.
All right, thanks, Eric. Thank you, Maria Clara Maureen Meyer from WOLA. I had a question on will versus capacity issue, and as an organization, we certainly are putting a lot of effort into Fiscalía General and what that means for Mexico. But in the event that there was more political will to go after corruption cases, my question is more, do you think there's enough capacity within the judicial system to really go, investigate the way they should? Looking at Duarte case in Veracruz right now, where some things are falling apart, it looks like because the PGR prosecutors didn't do their work the right way. Just wondering what would be the balance there between there's really no will to go after it versus even if there was the will, would there be the skill set there?
So. That's a tough question.
Is there one other question here? David Shirk? Okay.
You mentioned at the very end not being partisan in responses to problems of corruption. I'm curious. We're about to see an election in which there are pretty much everybody's an independent candidate. In other words, their party affiliation is questionable at best.
Okay.
Okay. In the United States, fighting corruption took place very much so in the early 20s and was driven by largely independent progressive movements. I'm wondering if that's what it takes, a shift away from partisanship towards just good governance candidates, and how we're likely to see that in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Maria Clara, you have a couple of minutes here to respond.
Okay. Maureen, you asked a very difficult question. I cannot answer, I cannot give you a general answer for that, but I would say, for instance, in Chihuahua, there has been, I would say, a remarkable performance of the judicial system. But it's not only of the judicial system. I mean, what worked in Chihuahua, I think, was a very close cooperation. And they don't have a sistema local anticorrupción yet, but they did work very closely, all the different government agencies. And obviously, their justice system is, I think, it was one of the first that actually reformed, the criminal justice system reformed about 15 years ago, and now I think it's beginning to perform much better than others in other states. So I think it's going to depend very much on the locality and very much on, again, who is governing and the citizen support that it has been able to achieve. The investigations of this corruption network in Chihuahua were met by, I mean, the President Peña Nieto dismissed them as electoral. And a couple of days later, 420 businessmen had signed a pledge in Chihuahua, supporting the governor. So, I mean, I think it's going to depend very, very much on local circumstances. And just to give you another answer to this, just last week we issued a press statement because one of these phantom enterprises, empresas fantasma, which are used for deviating public money, filed an amparo, and it was in the Supreme Court. And the amparo is against one of the regulations of the Treasury designed specifically to be able to investigate these empresas fantasma and stop them. And so we don't know what's going to happen in the Supreme Court, but it looked like, I mean, that's why we issued our press statement, because it looked like it was probably going to be given to them. So, I mean, this gives you an indication of where we stand regarding the judiciary. And the other question was, well, hopefully one of the candidates will come up with a good governance platform. I don't know. I mean, so far they have all the three, well, I mean, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, I would leave him aside. He's been talking about good governance for decades. Good governance seems to depend on his particular will, so I don't really know how, how much that will play out. But with the other two pre-candidates, precandidatos, well, they have a lot of baggage. And they haven't quite made convincing arguments yet. But we'll see, because it certainly is right there. I mean, I think it's going to be the most important subject in the campaign. So we'll see what happens. And yes, I just want to end by saying this is a very dismal, situation. But I don't think that we have any other alternative but to just keep pushing and try to make that Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción work. But it can't work in a vacuum. It has to go hand in hand with other fundamental reforms.
We have about 3 minutes left, and I know this is probably an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. If you take off your gorra, your hat, as the Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción, what in your terrific and lifelong experience have you seen as effective ways of combating corruption? I mean, what has worked from the perspective of Mexico? There has to have been some positive experiences or elements.
Well, I am, and I am going to be accused of being partisan, but I think that the Corral experience has been pretty amazing. I mean,
say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, he held a meeting about 2 weeks ago with the Red de Rendición de Cuentas, and he brought his team with him, his prosecutor and his auditor, and they just, we sat there for 3 hours and just listened to how they went about investigating this corruption network that was run by the previous governor, and who were the key people involved in this, and it was just very interesting to learn from that experience. And I think the key factor there was that they actually were able to undertake or to implement a very holistic approach with a lot of technical expertise. He really stressed that. They had a group of analistas financieros working there, because to follow the money trail is very difficult. So I think that you need a combination of that, of technical expertise, the right kind of officials, and political support, or popular support too.
So independent ability to investigate, technical capacity, and the role of civil society in some ways.
And
key.
Courage.
And courage. Easy enough.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I apologize, we've run over a little bit, but we will continue to discuss these topics when we launch our book, The Missing Reform, Strengthening the Rule of Law in Mexico. I know many of the panelists have profound ideas about these issues, so if you would break just for 5 minutes, grab a coffee, stretch your legs, and come back, we can keep this on track. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming back. It's always a risk when we send people off to have coffee. Will they return? But this is proof that the intellectual fodder that we gave you in the first half of the program was sufficient not to fill you up and send you on your way, but to get you stimulated for the next course. And the next course is something that I'm particularly delighted about. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. And I'm very, very happy that we are about to launch this book here today, which I'm sure that Eric has already talked about a little bit. But The Missing Reform, which was a project which was conceptualized here at the Wilson Center when Viridiana Rios was here as a fellow a couple of years ago. And we talked about what is it that we could do to actually come up with innovative ideas for improving the rule of law in Mexico. And a lot of the focus up until that point had been, of course, on questions of violence, but we wanted to go beyond that. We wanted to talk about rule of law more broadly, extending into the spheres of corruption, into economic management, and broader society. So I'm delighted that we have with us here 4 of the authors of this book. It's a compilation. I urge you to get a copy if you don't have one already. It's actually a pretty good read, I have to say. And one of the nice things about this book is that in addition to the 5 very substantive chapters, or 6 very substantive chapters, early on. You also have a series of shorter chapters, which was Viri's great invention, I think, here, which was to say, let's have short, snappy chapters where we present policy ideas, and hopefully these can spark debate in Mexico. Now, when we came up with this idea, the thought was that we'd push them out into the public realm and people would somehow latch onto them. But thanks to my incredibly slow reading and editing, this took a lot longer than we expected. And so we're now launching this, of course, during presidential election season in Mexico, which is fortuitous, serendipitous. There may even be some evil planning behind it. I'm not going to claim that at all, actually. I was just lazy in the editing. But I'm delighted that we're actually coming out with this book at this point in time. We are very fortunate to have Viri with us here today. And what I'd like to do in this panel is to ask Viri to give an overall introduction to the book, and then we'll move along with David, Enrique, and Matt talking about their chapters. And then we're going to come back and talk about how these ideas apply to the current questions and challenges of rule of law and security in Mexico today. Before I turn the microphone over to Viri, I just want to give a special shout out to Matt. He just told me that he just got tenure, which is an incredible thing, and we all know how much you have to suffer for that. So well done, Matt.
Thank you.
Viri, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. This is great turnout. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to talk about the inspiration of this book and how this book came alive. It's based on the idea that we failed. We failed by believing that changing the law was enough. We were pretty naive. We couldn't foresee that the problem of Mexico was much deeper, or we couldn't see. The problem of Mexico was a profound incapacity to implement the law. 5 years ago, you all remember these pictures, Mexico started its boldest transformation in recent history. It was a historical, powerful, multi-party coalition, El Pacto por México, led by then Enrique Peña Nieto, the newly elected president of Mexico. And together, they managed to approve 11 structural reforms that Mexico had needed for decades. Just to give you an example of this, back in 2011, a quarter of the experts of Mexico's central bank thought that lacking these reforms was the most important reason why the Mexican economy was not growing enough. About 14 months after Peña Nieto took power, not a single one thought that that was an issue. The reforms targeted issues such as lack of competition in private enterprises, perverse labor incentives inside this education sector, poor development of energy infrastructure, widespread informality of labor, monopolistic structures in telecommunications, and inadequate transparency regarding spending at the state level. On paper, Peña Nieto's administration had created a new Mexico, one that all Mexicans could feel proud of. This new Mexico was a country where Pemex, the national oil company, was a productive corporation, partnering with billion-dollar contracts with international giants to make energy cheaper and more accessible for all Mexicans. This Mexico was going to be the country that was finally going to ascend from the always shameful lowest position in the OECD ranking on education quality, because public schools were finally going to be led and commanded by professors whose jobs were not going to be inherited, whose jobs were not going to be given because they could prove to their union leaders that they had assisted to the mandatory protest during class times, but because they were going to show for the first time that they could test that they knew the material that they were teaching. This Mexico was going to be a country where monopolies were counting their final days. And once they were gone, the price of the basic basket of goods in Mexico would become 30% cheaper. Monopoly is in Mexico the most important driver of poverty. But the reforms failed to deliver. It was expected that Mexico was going to be growing in 2017 by 5%. Last year, we grew 2.1%. It's exactly the same amount of growth that Mexico has had in the last 18 years. In a state like Oaxaca and Michoacan, only 60% of the professors took the test, and only 7% approved the test with excellence. The Antitrust Commission, the one that was supposed to tackle and destroy all the monopolies of the country, remains understaffed and poorly funded. Just to give you an example of this, the annual budget of the Anti-Corruption Commission in Mexico, of the Antitrust Commission in Mexico, is $33 million. That's like 30, actually less, that's like 20%. The resources that are allocated to the U.S. Antitrust Division. So understanding what went wrong, is what this book is about. We, the authors, are a group of academics, activists, and journalists that came together to tell the story of a nation whose efforts fell short of its expectations, and to explain why the Mexico that we expected is yet to be. It is our argument that the approval of the structural reforms was the easiest step. Turning structural reforms into reality, moving them from paper to implementation, is the work that still needs to be done. To obtain tangible benefits for all Mexicans, the country needs to perform a much more complicated task, the task of creating a rule of law. It's time to stop writing then the big reforms, and it's time to start fixing the small printing. Reforming is clearly and has not been enough. The most imperative pending task of Mexico is making sure that rules apply to all and to everybody in the same way, independently of income, power, and status. Without a rule of law, approved reforms are, in the best scenario, good intentions, and in the worst case, selective tools, selective weapons to use discretionarily against political enemies. It is with this certainty, with the certainty that on-paper reforms won't take us any closer to the Mexico that we want, that this book came together. And that this book came together with a group of experts that are proposing specific and concrete recommendations to fix this and the real underlying problem of Mexico, lacking a rule of law. This book will walk you over the many areas in which Mexico reforming has not been enough, because informal privileges, unwritten agreements, or just blatant violations of the law without punishment have become the accepted statu quo. We explore topics from monopolistic markets to land tenure, answering questions like why Mexico's improvement in transparency have not created or improved the rule of law, what civil society could do or should not do in order to promote the rule of law, and why impunity is so common in Mexico's Congress. Ours is the most holistic view of how failing to implement the law is affecting Mexico beyond only enforcement operations. And I'm gonna use my time to go over a couple of examples of the book. The book has 16 chapters, so I'm just gonna take 3 of them. I will walk you over corruption, the problem of inequality, and freedom of press. So first, let's talk about the anti-corruption reforms. This is actually the second chapter in the book. So Mexico has today one of the most innovative and comprehensive anti-corruption legislations of Latin America. The law is our proud. We approved it in 2015, and it is the successful outcome of an anti-corruption battle fought by civil society against a Congress that for decades had successfully managed to avoid to include the definition of corruption in the penal code. Our system is the only one in Latin America where the board of citizens, a board of citizens selected by citizens, is responsible for presiding and coordinating a group of federal and local institutions like the tribunal, the general attorney, and the general auditor to prevent, identify, and sanction corruption, the 3 activities. In this system, the anti-corruption czar is not the UN, it's not the OAS, it's a group of citizens, it's the organized Mexican civil society. What a cool thing on paper. in reality, the legislation has not been fully implemented because legislators have been systematically trying to select an anti-corruption attorney general that favors their own parties. As of now, it's been 2 years that we have this amazing anti-corruption law and no attorney to properly implement it. As a result, we still live in the same country that we have always lived, nada más que con leyes más bonitas. Mexico is a country where 13% of its citizens are requested a bribe or a gift whenever they try to get a free public service. In 2015, the year this legislation was approved, Mexico's federal auditor reported that $1.8 billion of Mexico's taxpayers' money was lost. What does that mean? That means that the money was not used for it was supposed to be used. If it was used in a different way, we don't know what way that was, or it was not justified. And of course, nobody has found the money yet. Today, 2018, that quantity is 60% larger. This lost money is equivalent to the annual wage of 1 million Mexicans. Impunity there is a rule. Out of a total of 1,400 cases where the federal auditor has reported lost money, only 600 have turned into a legal sanction. That means that there is a 50% chance of just stealing the money. That's a pretty good deal for states like Veracruz that in only 1 year they lost $600 million. Doing it requires that the law is above power, is above wealth, and is above particular interest. We need to fight inequality, and this is the second topic I'm gonna tell you about very shortly. We cannot afford a country, a Mexico, where the safest way to be a criminal is to have political power or to have powerful friends. Rodrigo Medina, one of the ex-governors, one of the 15 ex-governors that are accused of diverting public resources, left jail a couple hours after he had been captured, just because his lawyers managed to make an effective legal defense showing that the prosecutors didn't give enough evidence of his case. Instead, we have cases like this: Sergio Sanchez, an impoverished resident of Mexico City that left prison 2 days ago after spending 8 years without a sentence. He had been falsely accused of homicide. For all we know, there is some evidence that Mexico City's police department have created a scheme in which fake witnesses incriminate people who lack quality legal defense. This all because the department needs to find a way to reduce its impunity statistics. We got to know about this case, the case of Sergio, because of Animal Político, an online news outlet, I'm sure everybody here knows about it, that has not only been the only or one of the few online places where newspapers where this note got published, but also one of the most important areas where corruption cases have been reported. And this takes me to my third and final point that I want to talk to you, and it's also part of the book, and it's about the freedom of the press. And here again, the problem is, as in the other two topics that I was discussing before, the small print and the impunity. Even if the freedom of the press is guaranteed in Mexico's constitution, most media outlets de facto operate as institutions that legitimize government actions. Just last year, 6 op-ed columnists resigned from El Universal, one of the most read newspapers in Mexico, precisely because the newspaper showed evidence of strong conflicts of interest. The discretionary allocation of government publicity spending has created a system where most printed media depends on the government to subsist. The current administration has spent every day $1.5 million in publicity. And this is not what the Congress approved. This is 71% more. 68% of Mexican journalists, when they are asked why they are being self-censored, they don't talk about violence, they actually talk about the advertisers. The absence of rule of law further discouraged serious journalism. During the present administration, 30 journalists have been assassinated in Mexico. In 2017, Mexico has become the third country where more journalists have been assassinated in the world. This is above many countries that are facing actual wars. We need to change media's dependence on government resources to transform journalism into a tool that effectively monitors power and that promotes accountability. We must develop a model in which government publicity does not exist to limit rigorous or ethical journalism, but to make it flourish. Only with a free press, Mexico will manage to name and shame those who use their privilege to take advantage of their powers to further promote inequality. Only with free press, the public discussion will move into the areas that really matter and not in the areas where the government wants us to talk about. So why don't we dare about stop talking about Mexico needing to cut taxes like the U.S. recently did, and start talking about how to make it more competitive. Let's talk about what matters, how to eliminate the formal and informal exceptions that make the very wealthy pay fewer taxes than the middle classes. Between 2015 and 2016, the Mexican government forgave 15 big enterprises the payment of $830 million. Not a single newspaper reported this or Animal Político. And we could keep going. Lack of rule of law is evident in Mexico's labor market, in its electoral system, in the implementation of the energy reform. All of these topics are addressed directly in the book. So I'm gonna stop here and I'm gonna invite you to read the book. As Duncan said, we have bigger chapters for good readers and then short chapters for people that just need like a very quick snap. But I wanna finish by saying that this book collects the intelligence, commitment, and support of so many people. It compromises the research, the ideas, and hopes of one of the most talented people I have ever worked with. Every single person that wrote in this book is a brave and inspiring professional who day to day, in different spheres, works to strengthen the rule of law in her or his own country. Working next to them to together create this book has been among the highest honors of my career. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Viri. That was a very, very nice and complete introduction. And let me just say that I'm enormously proud of the work that you put into this book, and I think it's a terrific product for us to put out, and not just because it's of the political timing, but I think these are all important ideas for Mexico in general, and hopefully it'll be read in places beyond Mexico as well.
Thank you.
David, let's turn to you. Your chapter focuses on the police forces. I know that you spend 99.9% of your time thinking about this anyway. This wasn't a heavy lift for you. I'm not minimizing the effort that you put in here, but we were lucky enough to get one of the best experts on this particular issue. So why don't you go ahead and sort of lay out the ideas that you present in this chapter?
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you, Duncan, for having me back at the Wilson Center. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank everyone that's here. Before we proceed, do I have control of the?
Sure.
Do I have command of the comm here? There we go. First, I want to. This is not the same presentation I just gave, but no problem. Before I move into this, I do want to say we have a new paper that we just put out on our website on the security situation in Tijuana. And Tijuana is a microcosm for many of the things that we're seeing playing out here today. I strongly encourage you to take a look at it, both in terms of the national rise in homicide rates that we've seen over the last year. Tijuana actually this year leads the nation in homicides, at least numerically. There's always a contest for who has the worst rate, depending on how small your unit of analysis is. But I would strongly encourage you to take a look at it because many of the same things I'm about to talk about have played out in that microcosm, that particular microcosm of Tijuana. But we just heard in the last panel a fantastic discussion about military issues, in particular U.S. Mexico military cooperation, security cooperation, and many of the important gains that have been made. And of course, there's been an enormous amount of support for military involvement in Mexico's domestic security situation, and particularly counter-drug operations for the last decade, really, actually for several decades, but in particular in the last decade, we have seen a heavy militarization of domestic security efforts. We saw that during the Calderon administration with the mass deployment of the Mexican military to multiple parts of the country. And one of the things that was mentioned in the last panel as well is the unintended and unwanted consequences of that massive deployment, which at that time, in particular, from say 2009 roughly till 2011, when we saw most military deployments and the most direct contact between the military and civilians, was a dramatic increase in the number of human rights abuses in that period, primarily because I think the military was not really prepared for this role and is not trained in domestic law enforcement. And it underscores the importance of building up a strong domestic law enforcement apparatus. The military, I think, arguably does not want to be in the position of having to deal with civilian law enforcement matters. It is there as a matter of last resort, as basically a bulwark against what has been seen to be unbridled crime and violence in Mexico, and a lack of civilian institutions to be able to deal with that problem. I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the characteristics of Mexican policing. In the earlier panel, it was alluded to the fact that one of the problems is there aren't enough police. That's somewhat true. Arguably, having a lot of police can be a good thing, as you can see in Chile. It can be maybe a bad thing, as you can see in Russia. But the problems I would say that Mexico has, I mean, Mexico is somewhere in the middle in Latin America in terms of numbers of police per capita. It's actually higher than the number of police per capita than we have here in the United States. So I don't think it's purely a question of the number of police. It's clearly, as was also mentioned, really a problem of the quality of police. Mexico has about 330,000 police, according to the last count last year from INEGI's employment census. There are different estimates of this number depending on how you count up Mexico's police agencies, but let's call it somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 police officers. That puts the number somewhere around 330 people per police. I'm going to move up front here as well. So, you can talk about the numbers of police. I think the more important question is questions of quality and how we deal with police reform in Mexico. Over the last, police reform is sort of a national sport in Mexico. There have been numerous rounds of police reform over as long as I've been alive. Which not since 1947, but basically there's been numerous attempts to try to reform police, and a lot of that effort at police reform has focused on reorganizing police, moving the structures of police and trying to find the right command, locus of command, or the right acronym or the right name for where we put police. In 2012, as was mentioned, one of the major commitments of the Peña Nieto administration was to address rule of law issues. There were two items in the Pacto that focused on this. One was the idea of a more coordinated, community-focused local police, Policía de Proximidad, and the other was a national federal gendarmerie for territorial control to sort of capture ungoverned spaces. And I'll talk a little bit about what's happened with this effort. But I think arguably the thing that perhaps draws the most attention to what are the major problems of policing during the Peña Nieto administration is the September 2014 Ayotzinapa massacre, which was mentioned multiple times in the earlier discussions. And I think what the Ayotzinapa massacre underscores are quite well are some of the fundamental problems that we see in Mexican policing. There's a general perception, I think, and a correct perception among ordinary Mexicans that police are not professional in the way they conduct themselves, that they are under-resourced. This is an actual photo from the Tijuana Police lavatory when we were doing a study that I'll mention in just a moment. This is bad. Sorry, whoops. Hang on. That police are corrupt. That police, as in the case of Iguala, were effectively infiltrated and captured by criminal elements. That police are ultimately, for all of these reasons, ineffective at actually catching criminals. These are real live Mexican police chasing criminals that I saw on the street. And the bottom line is that there is very little trust, public trust, in law enforcement in Mexico. People, the cifra negra, the low rate at which people report crimes in Mexico, which is very, very high, at a minimum of 3 out of 4 crimes don't get reported, largely because people have no confidence that there's any point in doing so, and actually also because they fear that going to report the crime will result in their re-victimization in some way by police. So looking at some of the challenges, so one of the things that we've tried to do through the Justice in Mexico program at the University of San Diego over the last several years is to try to measure and monitor police effectiveness. And when we started doing this in 2009, we decided to launch a series of surveys in different cities to try to basically take the pulse of police organizations, police agencies in different parts of the country. And at the time, there weren't police surveys in Mexico. There still aren't many police surveys in Mexico, and there are very few police surveys to look at comparatively in other countries. But it's, I think, a very important tool for trying to gauge what's going on inside the black box, if you will, as Gerardo said, of the judicial sector. So we conducted these surveys in 2009 in Guadalajara, in 2011 in Ciudad Juarez, great year for doing security work in Tijuana, in Juarez, and then in 2014 in Tijuana. And all told, we surveyed about 8,000 police officers through these efforts, all at the local level, typically getting a response rate of about 80%, so highly representative, even if the 20% most corrupt police were not participating in the survey. What we learned from that effort and what we've seen in some subsequent studies that we learned, this is at the municipal level, is number one, police are too old, right? And the average age of police in Mexico, at least at the local level, is about the age at which police in the United States and other developed countries are starting to think about retirement. And the reason they're so old is because they can't think about retirement. Because they are underpaid. The provisions for pensions and other means to sort of move on from their police careers are just not there. This was a surprising and unfortunate finding. Another issue is that police are overwhelmingly male. In the police agencies that we looked at, it was under 15% female. And that is a huge problem. Men left to their own devices are really problematic, as we learned this year. It's also a problem in terms of responding to the half of the population that they have to deal with that is not male. It leads to all kinds of problems. Men actually also, by the way, we behave better when women are around, as you can tell from this audience. The average years of education are relatively low. We found that 40% had only middle school education or less in the cities we looked at. And pay ranges in the cities we were looking at were actually relatively high compared to the national average. We also saw really disturbing trends in terms of the day-to-day duties and issues that police had to deal with. We found that at least 6 in 10 wound up buying some aspect of their own uniform. It's not that they weren't given uniforms, but they weren't given maybe the right size or enough of the uniforms to last throughout the year. Enough, they would get one pair of boots, but then the boots would fall apart within 6 months. We also found, importantly, I think very importantly, that a majority of officers felt that the criteria for promotions were unclear and unfair, that effectively the path to professional advancement was subjective and wholly dependent on your relationship with your superior rather than your ability to do your job. We also found that in large numbers, people on the force reported that there was corruption on the force, and that those who said that there was corruption, 7 out of 10 said that it was at the very highest levels in the department. Because there aren't many other surveys of police, it's really hard to know how to take that. I don't have an example of a police survey in the United States that I can point to where we've asked U.S. police what percentage of your department is corrupt or at what levels. But I kind of think 70 is probably a high number on the scale. One other organization that I know of, Causa en Común, has also done similar surveys, so we have some comparative data at the state level. They find some similar trends, particularly in terms of not being able to get promotions or not believing that the process is fair, or feeling, one of the things that they point to that we also found is that 6 out of 10 police officers wind up working 24-hour, talk about Jack Bauer, Mr. Calderon, they're working the 24-hour shift, right, which is 24 por 24. You get 24 hours on, 24 hours off, right? No bathroom breaks, just like Jack Bauer. These are not humane working conditions, and they're certainly not good working conditions in which we would try to get the best out of law enforcement officers. The other consistent finding is just the low levels of pay. They found the average level of pay to be around $600 per month, $600. This is U.S. dollars per month, but some states like Chiapas where they're earning less than $300 a month. One of the things that is very problematic about policing is just, as we've said, the lack of standards. They find a lack of, this is really hard to read, that's supposed to be yellow, but it's chartreuse, greenish in certain places. This is the only one that's supposed to be green, which is Querétaro, and the others are supposed to be yellow. But in any event, we're talking about low levels of professional standards throughout most of the country. So what do we do? In my chapter, which is I think about 500 words long, it's very short, but I lay out some of the considerations, some of the things that we've learned. One is systemically, I think Mexico has, over the last decade, has been working to implement judicial reforms, but police have not really been brought into that process. Police are not well informed, don't feel well informed as well about what their role is going to be in the new criminal justice system, and many people are pointing to this new criminal justice system as failing. It's not the system that's failing, it's the police and prosecutors that are supposed to be doing their job in that new system because they don't know how, they haven't been adequately prepared. That's not the fault of the reform, that's a problem of building capacity among police and prosecutors. One of the things that has, I think, been important to improving policing in many different parts of Mexico is the allocation of block grants through the FASP and Subsemun programs, by which states are able to apply for, states and municipalities are able to apply for funding to help improve their local policing. They submit a plan, they get the money, and then unfortunately there's no evaluation or assessment of how that worked out. But those kinds of block grants could be a real tool for improving policing. Community policing needs to be a core objective, and one of the things that's happened to policing worldwide for the last 50 to 100 years, particularly with the advent of automobiles and air conditioning, is the distancing of police from the communities that they work in. And certainly that's a serious problem for Mexican policing and something that needs to be addressed. The other thing that I think is very important systemically is that, as Viri pointed out, and Mary Claire, citizens are really taking a more active interest and a bigger role in all aspects of reform. And one of the areas that they can really help out is through citizen observatories and citizen committees for public security. But for these to work, they need to be adequately empowered, both through the information that they're given and through the ability to have input on policy at whatever level they're working, which could be municipal, state, et cetera. A second set, I would say at the department level, as is pointed out by the data that I've presented, one of the problems is just needing to have merit criteria and clear expectations for advancement on the force. Higher levels of compensation that are adequate enough to bring people who are highly educated and competent to do their jobs. I believe that Mexico needs to increase female recruitment and also take steps to improve conditions for women on police forces to ensure that their voices are heard, that they're able to attend to the needs of in particular female victims, but they can play a role in helping to move some of these reforms forward. And finally, there's a real lack of adequate internal investigations and whistleblower protections within the force. Officers just do not feel that they can ever question or speak out when there is a problem of corruption on the force, and that they're, if they do so, they're likely to be either demoted or killed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Thank you, David. That was fabulous. I want to move along to Enrique. Enrique, of course, has been a great friend to the Mexico Institute for a number of years, and particularly on this issue of crime prevention. Enrique, why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much, Duncan. I want to take just 1 minute to say thank you to Viri and Duncan, Eric, and the rest of the team at the Mexico Institute for both having me here today, but also obviously for giving me the chance to contribute to this very, very interesting document. It's really an honor. It's great to have it right next to me. When Viri contacted me to write something about the intersection of the justice, the rule of law, and violence prevention, it really, she really was putting a challenge in many ways. The most important challenge is that this conversation, this nexus between rule of law and violence prevention, had not been discussed in Mexico. The formula, the equation of improving and reforming the rule of law in Mexico has never been about reducing the rates of violence. That's one thing. It has been a very abstract conversation. It has been, in many ways, it has been a conversation more about reforming top-down a system, a reform that starts with a map of Mexico that sees the country as a whole. It doesn't take into account the different tones of gray that are really important to address the problems of security that we have in Mexico. It's been a reform that, for the most part, has focused on improving the law, tweaking the law, even improving spatially the courts, training judges, but has never paid attention to, again, connecting these two dots. When you, now I'm based in the U.S., and when you hear about criminal justice system and you see the intersection of how the tactics on the ground are really key to change the trends of crime in very particular hotspots of any given city in the U.S., you start seeing that connection, and having the U.S. as a framework to understand this connection was really interesting. My small chapter, so if you like long reads, don't read mine. You can use my presentation. My chapter focuses or tries to put the reader in the day after the reform was enabled or enacted, and asks, what is different for me as a citizen walking on the street today? What's the big difference for me as a citizen if I'm walking in any given city in Mexico? And the truth is that the difference is not big. Thank you so much. So before I go back to the street level, the question that Viri put on the table for me was really relevant. There's a very strong correlation on the rule of law and levels of violence. This map, which is taken by from the World Justice Project, shows the level of the rule of law, the strength of the rule of law in a number of countries, and you can see where the rule of law is weak, And you can very quickly identify the most violent countries in the world. Latin America today, with only 8% of the world's population, concentrates 30% of the homicides in the globe. Only 4 countries, by coincidence, the ones that are really red, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil, with very weak rule of law, explain or account for 25% of all the homicides that take place in the world any given year. Only 4 countries concentrate 25% of all the homicides in total numbers. Different rates, obviously the higher rates we see in smaller countries, which also have a very weak rule of law. But in practical terms, there's a very, very strong correlation between the rule of law and levels of violence. This is the 2016 chart for Mexico, and it shows. I recommend you to go and see this document, but it shows where the biggest weaknesses are. Almost in every aspect, there are areas in which the country is completely underperforming. The one that is really high in this case, for example, is the absence of conflict. That means that Mexico is not in war. So the rule of law index gives us 100% points there. That's the only one in which we have nothing to work on. But not only in practical terms, also in very simple theoretical terms, the equation that we have always worked with when you link violence prevention or violence rates and the rule of law is that lower impunity increases the trust and the legitimacy of the state, that in turn changes behaviors or makes people behave in a certain way, which helps keep improving the rule of law. This very basic cycle is completely broken and it's not connected in the Mexican framework to improve the rule of law. These lines just simply do not exist. It's no surprise, it's not big news for, I'm sure, anyone here, that this year was the most violent year in recent history in Mexico. I think that it's very interesting to see that we're hitting a high a year and a half after we started the implementation, the implementation of the new justice system. So what does that say in terms of, is there something that we can say about the narrative of some politicians saying the beginning or the establishment of the rule of law, or the new justice system is correlated to violence? I think it's a question that we should, I'm not saying that's true, I just think that it's very interesting, or it's very important to continue researching that connection. In terms of trying to connect these two parallel policies, the status quo is the one that I just explained more or less. On the judicial reform, it's been mostly a top-down design and implementation without taking into consideration the first respondents. So because it was top-down, all the money, all the time, all the effort, the big conferences, all the discussions have been for judges. It's been among lawyers for the most part, sometimes engineers looking at the flow of the process of implementation of law in the country, but no trainings for police, no trainings for ministerios públicos. So again, if you're walking on the street in Mexico City, the first respondent, the people that you are in touch with are mostly, I mean, in terms of justice, is police. If something happens to you, you go to ministerios públicos, and that we all know the stories, right? Some of the stories that Viri just presented are connected to this very weak training, very weak capacity at the local level. It's been focused mostly on procedural aspects. I think there are interesting successes in terms of training new lawyers to understand, obviously, the implications of the new system. I'm not trying to say that the long-term reform has not been useful, but I'm trying to say that it has been incomplete. On the violence prevention side, I was tempted to use the Saving Mexico Time magazine cover, but I didn't. The administration started also putting on the table that this administration would be about preventing violence, right? They created a new program that was announced with, you know, with a very priesta kind of fashion. 3 years later, it was completely defunded by the Secretaría de Hacienda. Now it has been reestablished. A new vice ministry was created. Many of with lots of contradictions between the general law to prevent violence in Mexico and the creation of this new vice ministry. But I think the conclusion for me is that this has been only used as a political narrative. There was a very strong need in political terms to differentiate the current administration from the previous, and they used prevention as a great way to do it. It was also a great way to deploy resources completely or not paying attention to what the evidence showed, with very far from what data establishes as priorities in the country. And the most important thing for me is that there was a lack of conceptual or programmatic connectivity between the judicial reform and the violence reduction efforts in the country. So just what can we do? How can we move forward? I am an advocate of action. I am an advocate of, obviously, supporting those long-term efforts. But the question is, like, what do we do today? How do we operate to try to, break the cycle and start working with these initiatives? In the U.S., in many years ago, when the crime was really high, the Clinton administration enacted the crime bill, which has been contested and questioned nowadays. I think the parameters of that and the implications and the outcomes, unintended consequences of that particular bill are very present in the discussions in the U.S. But violence was reduced, and I think having never been an explicit intention of the Mexican government to reduce violence, I think that's what we need. So my proposal is just one, and is to create a national violence reduction strategy that connects to these worlds or these two policies, among others, for sure. But it would be a national violence reduction strategy that tailors solutions for geographic and demographics with unequal access to justice. I think I'm not a lawyer. I'm an architect, actually. But I think it's very clear, and it's beautiful to hear this notion of justice for all. When you walk on the streets of Mexican cities, when you are from Mexico, you know very well that some populations in some places have better access to justice than others. This is true, I'm sure, everywhere in the world. The concentration, violence is about geographic and demographic concentration, and I think a solution that incorporates a violence prevention perspective with an angle of rule of law also needs to take into consideration these two factors. So how can we tailor solutions at the ground level for communities as places, but also communities as social groups that are urgently requiring solutions in terms of justice? Very recently, now the case of Morelia has been on the news, like a very interesting effort to start strengthening tailored solutions for particular neighborhoods. There are great examples also in the U.S., in Spain, where community courts are established at the local level and help solve very targeted problems at the ground level. The second aspect or characteristic of this national violence reduction strategy would be the enabling of street-level action, and I want to highlight the word action. That includes alternative sentencing and procedural justice. The evidence behind procedural justice in particular is really big. Even with weak, somehow weak rule of law, the procedure, the way the law is being enforced, the way I'm interacting with authority, with police, with ministerios públicos, can create a perception of fairness, which will help the virtuous cycle that we want to create in one of the slides that I presented. And third, bridge the gap between justice measures with evidence-informed violence prevention efforts. I think when David is talking about community policing and making it core within police institutions, he's referring to, we've seen a plethora of initiatives in Mexico creating community policing, but without really connecting those to the real law enforcement activities that take place on the ground. So it's really, really baking in these preventive efforts within this notion of violence reduction and measuring this strategy against violence reduction rates, I think would be something that can be a part of a subsystem, obviously. It's not the only component, but if we talk about violence reduction, there's room to think about that, to create accountability, and also to direct resources for a problem-oriented approach in this regard. My last slide is just this notion that a justice system that works with the explicit aim of reducing violence through smart and fair policy frameworks, it would be the base for this, and that there are no, prevention is an effect of a well-functioning system that incorporates the social prevention system, social policy, law enforcement, and justice. And the combination of these three forces would produce a preventive effect in many behaviors that are current in the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, Enrique. I think that your presentation hits exactly what we're trying to do here, is to get some sort of ideas out there on the table that then people can discuss. And let me emphasize that the purpose of this project from this point on is to socialize these ideas as much as possible in Mexico so that they're available for whoever comes in as the next administration and the next Congress. Matt, the justice system has been discussed at length so far, but we'd be very interested in hearing your ideas that you've written down in your chapter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Eric in the back, for giving me the high five that you can hear me back there, and thank you, Duncan and Vidi, and all of you here. This is a wonderful opportunity. As Enrique mentioned, it's been a great experience to contribute to this chapter and to this effort, and to be back here with the Mexico Institute and the Wilson Center again. So thank you. In my chapter, which is the second chapter in section 1 of the book, I offer a survey or an overview of some of the obstacles or challenges facing the justice system and the rule of law in Mexico, focusing primarily on the criminal justice system and criminal procedure. With that in mind, there's, as if you've been here for the first panel and for the first part of this panel, you'll see that there's substantial areas of overlap. Hopefully, we're complementing each other in what we're saying. I think we are. But you'll see a lot of resonance with what I have to say with what has been said earlier today. That said, mine is not one of the snappy chapters. So buckle down when you start reading this one. Set aside the afternoon. But I'd be happy to make some snappier comments in Q&A or afterwards, so please feel free to approach me. In terms of conceptual architecture or conceptual clarification, I'd just like to say that there are a lot of concepts out there on the rule of law. In this particular chapter, I leverage the frameworks set forth by the Agency for International Development, for USAID. But it's essentially complementary with the World Justice Project and what Maria Clara Costa said earlier today and what my colleagues on this panel have said just now. I will, though, say that I structure the discussion in the chapter according to 5 components: order and security, legitimacy, checks and balances, fairness, and the effective application of the law in justice institutions. Within the 4th component of fairness, there's 4 subcomponents: equal application, procedural fairness, protection of rights and liberties, and access to justice. As you can tell, there's a lot of overlap, even if you're just thinking back to one of the images that Enrique put up just a second ago from the World Justice Project. There's a lot of overlap, so we're essentially talking about the same ideas. Starting with order and security, I don't offer an in-depth discussion of crime, violence, security, or insecurity, but I do want to highlight some prominent patterns and major trends. I was going to talk about the homicide rate, but I think enough has been said about that. That is a major trend. It's a worrying trend. Even when the homicide rate was taking a slight dip in 2014, 2015, it was, looking back at, again, one of the slides from Enrique, it was on a 20-year high, right? So even that even though there was a temptation to think about that dip or that flattening as in an optimistic way, historically, it was still incredibly preoccupying. So it makes the increase since then that much more worrisome, especially this last year. The nature of violence is also particularly striking. Some has been said about this already. There have been some, the killings are of a high number, but they're also grotesque and very striking, many of them. I don't know that enough has been said about mass graves. The rising number of mass graves is incredibly striking. And then I just wanted to emphasize massacres as well. A lot has been said about the Ayotzinapa massacre, but it's not alone, right? We're talking about dozens of massacres in recent years. There's very little data on other kinds of high-impact violent crimes, extortion, kidnapping, but the data that we do have is very preoccupying as well. Analysts speak of kidnapping explosions, extortion explosions, so we have that on the table as well. Further, it's not just ordinary people or vulnerable people that are targeted by this violence, people in prominent positions of power, very visible positions of power are also targeted. Police, soldiers, politicians, journalists. So that fact is also worrisome. Within this context of order and security, I'd like to slow down a little bit and talk about some of the victimization data that is a little bit more detailed and it offers a little bit more information about some of the recent patterns and trends. Victimization has been rising since the mid-2000s. So these are surveys by different sources, including the America's Barometer surveys that Rebecca Bill Chavez mentioned earlier today, but also the Mexican government's own victimization surveys. From about 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 people reporting being victimized, again, whether they go to authorities or not, right? But they report being victimized in these anonymous surveys. That number has risen to about 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 people in the last 2 to 3 years. In 2016, 1/3, 1 to 1/4 of people have been victim of a crime. So 1 in 3 people, say in this room, 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 people have been victims of a crime in the previous 12 months. There are strong reasons to think that these are conservative estimates. These are largely individuals reporting this. These are not households. So if you think about the sense of insecurity being framed by not just your own experience, but the experience of your loved ones, relatives, friends, etc., these individual statistics are a conservative estimate of household insecurity. Also, a lot of these numbers report only single instances of victimization. They're not reporting multiple instances of victimization over the course of previous 12 months. So we have every reason to think that those rates are higher. Indeed, the most recent data from America's Barometer from last year reports that 25% of people have been victims of a crime 2 or more times in the preceding 12 years. Now we start to speak of the concentration of crime. I'm updating a little bit the material that's in the chapter, but the concentration of crime that Enrique was talking about, right? If you look at the data even further, about 5% of the population has been a victim of a crime 5 or more times in the previous 12 months. You might be tempted to think that that's a small number, that's a small percentage of the population, right? 5% of people. But that's an incredible concentration of repeated victimization. Right? 5% of the population is suffering from a crime every 2 to 3 months. Right? Again, we're not talking about household figures, we're talking about individual figures. Enrique sort of set the stage also by talking about geographic distributions. These are all national figures, so if we start to unpack these and look closely at some states, Estado de Mexico and Mexico City are some of the most preoccupying locations. In the state of Mexico, the most populous state in the country, 1 in 2 people report being a victim of a crime in the preceding 12 months. There's a table in the chapter that I would draw your attention to that identifies the states in which that have reported rates higher than 30% in any of the last 6 years. Along with these objective experiences of crime, actual experiences of victimization, we could think about subjective perceptions of insecurity, and we have a lot of data on that as well, and those are also high and worrisome. Again, Rebecca Bill Chavez mentioned some of the America's Barometer data referring to the insecurity in Mexico's northern border region. But I would like to emphasize that this insecurity is also especially concentrated among women. Right? More than a third of women feel unsafe in their homes, at school, and at work, and more than 80% of women feel unsafe on the street. In Tamaulipas, one of the cases that drew my attention, due to fear and insecurity, more than 50%, more than half of women reported that they stopped going out to eat. More than 60% stopped using taxis, going for walks, going out to theater or movies, or going out to visit friends or family. And more than 75%, more than 3/4 of women, stopped going out at night entirely. So at least 1 out of every 3 women has stopped routine activities and social interactions outside of the house, and most people associate with, that most of us would associate with a normal, sort of ordinary daily life. Setting stark boundaries in their lives and increasing their social isolation. I'm reading a little bit from the chapter just because I want to emphasize this. And 1 in 8 women abandon their education, right, due to insecurity, hindering their long-term potential for economic and other kinds of growth. I would echo Enrique's call for a more preventive, proactive mindset with regards to crime. There's a tendency to favor short-term reactive policies. And from my own perspective, even when there is a spotlight on so-called preventive policing, which often basically boils down to police driving around trying to intercede or interrupt a crime that might be in progress, right? That's not truly a preventive mindset, right? When we're talking about identifying the root sources of crime and criminality and try to address those very early on, and largely those end up being structural, demographic sources. At least that's what the research tells us. So again, I would say that a major challenge, which Enrique identified in his own talk, is to develop truly proactive, preventive policies and implement them. Turning to legitimacy, again, Enrique set the stage nicely, talking about the link between impunity, right, all of this insecurity, and trust and confidence in institutions. I would also add sort of the sense of these institutions as being normatively appropriate. Again, we have lots of polling data from America's Barometer and from the Mexican government itself showing declining trust and confidence. Very few people, echoing David Shirk's comments, very few people report a crime when they're actually victimized. Most people that do not report their victimization talk about the fact that doing so would be useless, maybe even dangerous or risky to themselves. So we have the sense of the justice institutions themselves being perceived as inept, incompetent, or even dangerous, right? One of the most worrisome things to me has come from my own work with David Shirk. We've worked on one of those Justice Barometer surveys together, and even legal elites report some of the same patterns, right? So in a survey of judges and prosecutors, David can correct me, I think it was the 2011 survey, but judges and prosecutors report these same behaviors and attitudes, right? About the uselessness, incompetence, or perhaps even dangerousness of reporting crimes that they themselves, right, as legal experts, have experienced. Turning to checks and balances, I would say there are some major advances under the criminal procedure reform that came together finally in 2016, but is still being implemented. Separations, for instance, separations of certain functions between judges and prosecutors, even separating out different stages of criminal procedure, according to different types of judging, right? Sort of the pre-trial motions versus the trial versus sentencing phases. These have all been separated out, which create some nice checks and balances. However, alongside some of the comments that have already been made about training and education, public defenders have largely been left out of this process. And that has two major consequences. One, the rights of the accused are left highly vulnerable. And two, a core counterweight in the justice system is left out of the picture. Turning to fairness, there's a lot that I could say about equal protection, procedural fairness, protection of human rights, or access to justice. Some of my own work has drawn attention to the geographic unevenness of the performance of various justice institutions. But I would also say that the justice institution tends to ensnare the poor and marginalized. These are points that Elena Asaola and Marcelo Bergman have made in their own work. In 2013, 80% of all inmates in Mexico City and the state of Mexico were in custody for theft or property crimes. And most of these crimes were for very small amounts of money, right? And so one of those examples was up on a slide earlier on this panel. We could, with regards to procedural fairness, we could talk about the Ayotzinapa case as a kind of crucial case of an absence of procedural fairness. Enough has been said about the Ayotzinapa case today, but I would say that there were some reasons to expect that at least here there would be some more attention to procedural matters, in part due to the high visibility, the international visibility of the case, including this group of interdisciplinary experts that was brought on to oversee the case, and in part because it was coming at the end, or towards the end, right in the last 2 years of this new reform to the criminal justice system. And yet, aside from secrecy, obstruction, lack of access to key witnesses, the disappearance of key witnesses, like a videotape from one of the court evidence rooms, mishandling of evidence. This group of interdisciplinary experts also found that the statements of key witnesses had been obtained with the use of torture and violence, and were therefore unreliable or inadmissible. Again, some of the worst violations of procedural fairness in one of the cases where we would expect, at least here, right? Perhaps we have some good signs that we might see positive evidence. In another one of the findings from the Americas Barometer, there is a really worrisome absence of the public's confidence in the courts to be able to deliver a fair trial. So from 2004 to 2006, about a third of the public expressed little trust in this core procedural right. This rose to about 37% in 2008, 41% in 2010 to 2012, and then jumped to 50%, right? Half of the general public does not have confidence in the court's ability to deliver a fair trial. Again, coming at the end of this reform process, right, that has received so much attention. With regards to the protection of human rights, the data is also similarly worrisome, right? General public increasingly perceive basic rights as vulnerable and unprotected. There is a not only are the levels bad, but the trend is worrisome as well, right? Early on, about 10 years ago, a quarter of the population thought that fundamental human rights were not protected. This rose to a third, rose to a half, and the data from last year report 56% of the general population do not think that basic human rights are protected in Mexican society. This rises to 75%. 3/4 of the general population have a lukewarm, right? On a scale of 1 to 7, they respond 4 or lower about whether basic human rights are protected in Mexico. 75%. So only 25% of the population is giving any kind of positive response to that question. I'm getting the sense that I should speed up here. How many minutes do I have?
I'm just depressed. That's all. I have to say it's. I think it's Please go on. Complete the presentation. It's just
right.
it's awfully sad, isn't it?
I was going to say something. It is. I agree. I was going to say something about press freedom, but I think also freedom of expression but I think Viridiana covered that in her introduction to this panel. With regards to access to justice, inmates in Mexico City and the state of Mexico increasingly report that they simply do not understand why they are where they are. So that the last figure that we have available is, again, 80% of inmates do not understand why they are where they are. And most of these cases, again, are for property crimes, and most of those cases are for property crimes involving a small amount of property. Lastly, with regards to effective application, I think some of this has been covered by my colleagues on this panel already. I would draw attention to maybe two ways in which we might think about whether the justice institutions are able to apply the laws effectively. One is in their ability to simply contain violence, right? Not even to reduce violence, but to contain violence, and I don't think the evidence is very good in that regard. The other is simply their ability to function effectively, competently on a day-to-day basis in administering justice. Here, under this section on ordinary, everyday administration of justice, I would point to two challenges. One is the weak structure of careers, and David Shirk spoke about this with regards to police and prosecutors, but especially with regards to police. And in surveys of police, this evidence, this challenge comes across very clearly. Again, thinking about what David Shirk said, I tend to think of, and other analysts tend to think of the police as the tip of the spear or the edge of the knife of the state. I'm not quite sure what to think about that metaphor of spears or knives in terms of the state. But if we think of the police as the most familiar face of the state, as David Shirk was suggesting, and I think as Enrique was also suggesting, then this very familiar face is not very well equipped to come across well, right? Not just to leave a good first impression, but then to come back and have repeated positive interactions. The other challenge is institutional instability, and here I don't need to say anything beyond what David Shirk said in pointing out that police reform appears to be some kind of national sport in Mexico. Right, the very frequency of reform generates instability as the actors are trying to adapt time and time again to change. So here I would say that what we need is perhaps, again, longer horizons, a more strategic vision, and a real commitment to the results of the design that is adapted. Ironically, it was just in this discussion in December of 2017 when the internal security law was approved that on the table was also a reform to more fully professionalize the police. Mm-hmm. And that reform was discarded in favor of the internal security law, right? That was a particularly poignant moment. If it wasn't on the same day, it was very close, right? Where this initiative, this impulse to professionalize the civilian police was set aside in favor of the internal security law. So that was an ironic, poignant, and disappointing moment. So on that note, I think I will stop and say thank you, and I look forward to questions and answers.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm sitting here and I'm listening to all the presentations, and the thought it's inescapable that 10 years ago, if we'd had a panel talking about these issues, many of the things that we would have said would have been exactly the same. And beyond just a facile plus ça change, I think that this is one of the things that makes us begin to question. I mean, you've talked about the need for more money, the need for procedural, structural change, the question of public confidence. It's always occurred to me that there's no shortage of good ideas in Mexico, as evidenced by the authors in this book. It's always, as Viri said earlier on, there's no shortage of actually good laws in Mexico. And we've done the diagnostic over and over again. And without wishing to stretch the comparison at all, when you look at where success has been achieved in Mexico in different areas, and, you know, I'm a firm believer that something like the energy reform was a successful reform. We had the diagnostic for years beforehand, and the problem got worse and worse and worse and worse, and eventually somebody came along and said, you know what, we've actually got to do something about this. And it was a question of political will that actually moved it forward. It was political will and getting together the political coalition. Is there any way that you four, any of you, could see that kind of conjuncture of political will and political cooperation, collaboration coming together at any point in the near future? I'll let you mull on that while I take questions from the audience. I'd like to take 3 questions, if I may. There are 15 questions out there. Who do I choose? My favorites, of course. There's a lady up at the back there in a pink sweater. I can't see your face is in shadow. Yes.
June Beidel with the Congressional Research Service. This is for David or whoever wants to answer it. Looking for glimmers. What about the Nicaragua example in terms of policing, or perhaps we could call it an anomaly? My understanding from very light reading on this is there's something of a machista critique going on because of the presence of women on the force. And sort of really doing community policing somehow. So just to look for a glimmer of why don't they have the same kind of homicide, crime, etc.
Okay, let's take a question over from this side of the room. I have one down here. Inigo. And then the next question will be down here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, David has painted us a picture of the Mexican police, which is, like Duncan said, takes us just to a very, very dark place. And I can really back it up because 15 years ago, I was chief of analysis for the Querétaro State Police. I'm sad to see that the statistics have not moved, only slightly. So here we are, and we're at the crossroads, and we have the military, really, which have been doing public security or internal security for the past 52 years, which are the highest rated institution performing public security. The trust level is up at 84 to 86%. And they are setting up, or at the very early stages of setting up, a military police force, which is will be really not different from what the Colombian National Police looks like, or what the Chilean Carabineros or the Italian Carabinieri. They have a fully professional meritocratic system in place. So what are the arguments against it?
Thank you. And question right here.
Yes. I address my question to Mr. Betancourt.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes. My name is Professor Goldberg. I live and work in Italy, but I have lived 10 years in Colombia, in Cali, Colombia, during the narco violence. And I would suspect that the chart for kidnapping follows your chart for homicides. When I lived in Colombia, kidnapping was a growth industry and was quick to get results because people purposely avoided the police. And talking about police, I think you really need professionals when you deal with kidnappers. What do your statistics show?
Thank you very much. Just a very, very brief comment on my part about the David's point about more women police officers. One of the many times that I was asked for a bribe in Mexico City was one night I was driving home and I was pulled over by the police, and there were 2 police officers in the car, man and a woman. It was the man who came over to me and requested the bribe, basically. And when I refused to pay it, and he said, well, you have to come down to the delegación with us. And I said, yeah, that's fine. He said, well, you don't want to go down to the delegación. It's dangerous down there. And I said, but you're going to be there. He says, I know. And he didn't quite understand why. I gave him my driver's license, and we turned around. We went back down the hill, and about a kilometer later, the car stopped. It was the woman who got out of the car and gave me back my driver's license, saying, you know what, you can go home. I'm not going to waste our time with you. The point of this is that, let's face it, humans are humans. And the tendency of women to be corrupt may be less than men, but you're not going to eliminate the problem just by having that. And it always struck me as interesting in Mexico City when it was women who could give you a traffic ticket and men weren't allowed to. It didn't eliminate the problem either. I mean, things may have got better. And so, just my own personal experience with this, and it's anecdotal entirely, of course, but it's like, it's a strange little extra dimension. Okay, Viri, why don't you kick off the responses?
Thank you. I'd like to address the point of political will, and I also like to address the point of Professor Colbert. So if we look at the graph of homicides and we compare it to the graph of kidnapping, they actually have completely different trends. Kidnapped stopped in close to 2011. And from there, we saw an important diminishing in kidnapping, and right now we are probably having the least amount of kidnappings that we have seen in the last 10 years. And the difference, we have both the statistics going down. So it's a fact. Like organizations that study from civil society kidnapping have shown that it has gone down. And the reason why that has happened is because in Mexico, there is a big difference on the political will of authorities to fight the crimes that are affecting the middle class and the upper classes than to fight the crimes that are affecting the rest of the people. And this goes back to the core of the argument of this book, which is that in Mexico, the law exists, except it doesn't exist for everybody, or it doesn't exist for everybody with the same strength. There is a reason why violence went down in Nuevo León, and it was because most of the important businessmen and business group of the country exist in Nuevo León. And they managed to, A, convince the government, but also fund themselves by taxing themselves in private ways to create a better police. The same thing is not gonna happen in Guerrero, it's not gonna happen in Michoacán, it's not gonna happen in Oaxaca, in places that are less politically alive, precisely because a different type of Mexican exists. So we have these two tiers of enforcement. In terms of political will, and to finish because we don't have a lot of time, the problem is exactly the same. The problem is that we live in a country where implementing the law is not necessarily a requirement. Therefore, the law is implemented discretionarily. The reason why anti-corruption measures are emerging right now is because it has the two conditions that are going to make political will actually take the next step. One is a civil society that is organized and requesting this, a civil society that is also the middle class and the upper class, by the way. And second, press, the freedom of the press, which is a topic that both Andrew and I discussed in our presentations.
Thank you. David.
So I'll also very briefly talk about political will. I mean, in theory, in a democracy, political will is achieved when votes matter, voters are informed, voters feel empowered, and voters are active or actively agitated by something. Votes don't matter, I don't think, as much as they should to politicians in Mexico. At least they haven't for the last 100 years, because there's no consequence when you're not able to be reelected. So we're about to see maybe a change in the next few years as voters matter more. It's difficult for voters to be informed if they're under, if the press is under siege. But on the flip side, we've seen a democratization of information through technology, YouTube, et cetera, and the only thing that could complicate that would be for the things that you see on your smartphone or on Facebook to be falsified by a Russian bot, which is something I think we have to worry about in the upcoming election. A sense of empowerment, I think, very much depends on whether or not voters have an education, a job, and things like that, which Mexico's made some progress on. But in the absence of these things, I mean, what will motivate politicians are the constituents that maybe actually matter, and that might be the business community. It might be powerful forces that unfortunately are illicit businesses, and I think we're hopefully seeing a shift in Mexico towards the theory of the way democracy works as opposed to the reality. On Nicaragua, I'm not an expert on Nicaragua, June, so I'd love to talk to you more about what you're seeing there. But I mean, lower crime rates are also partly a function of just, I mean, Nicaragua's problems, I think, are very different from Mexico's problems right now. On the question of why not the military, if it has the highest public approval ratings, Inigo's question, I mean, I alluded to it in my presentation. The military is not really equipped to deal with civilian populations, and as a result, we often tend to see higher rates of human rights abuses as a result of the military's insertion. Arguably, you could train the military to have that role, but I think a democratic police force is a desirable alternative to that. The question of, so I just want to say something about kidnapping following homicides. You know, in the study we just did in Tijuana, what's really interesting is homicides have gone way up, but other indicators of crime have not. And it's not purely a measurement or reporting error. I actually think that there are just different trends that we're seeing with the violence that we're seeing today in Mexico compared to, say, 5 or 10 years ago, that I don't have time to get to in the last few seconds. But I do want to say something about women. I do think that there is something different about the way that women comport themselves than men, in the sense that 90% or more of violent actors in any society around the world have one thing in common.
They're men.
A Y chromosome, right? And or at least the ones that get caught, right? Because they're the ones that go to jail. But I think that there is something about gender and violence, gender and crime, that we need to pay attention to. And I do think that it also affects the way that institutions work. It's why we should have more women everywhere, at all levels. And you know, look at this table. We have, I think, a real need to balance out. I think gender plays in to these issues in ways that are subtle but important.
Okay. Generally speaking, I think that Viri really addressed well, particularly the question about homicide. But I can give you an example. I was part of an effort in 2010 to reduce violence in Ciudad Juarez when I was working for the federal government. And what brought us there was the homicide rate. So the reason why we arrived to Juarez was the homicide rate. When we arrived to Juarez, as federal agents, the first interaction we had was obviously with those who are the powerful in the city. So, you know, maybe the president of the local university, the mayor, obviously, the representative of the state, but mostly the business community. And they were the ones who were mostly affected by kidnapping. The first decision that was made above my paycheck was to create an anti-kidnapping special prosecutor. Kidnap because that was the demand. So you came here because of the homicides, but we're not worried about the homicides. We're worried about kidnapping. So you solve that problem, and then we can discuss other issues. Then the special prosecutor was established. Kidnapping rates went down to 0 very quickly. So when the state decides that they want to tackle one complex issue, can be achieved. I think that's something that we can say. I mean, the worst crisis of kidnapping in Mexico is Ciudad Juarez. To 0, like in months. Then only after that, then okay, they were like, we can start discussing homicides. So I think at the center of this conversation, there's this notion of social justice.
Yeah.
We're discussing issues of social justice. I don't believe in political will. I believe in political interest. I know politicians. There's not such a thing as political will. I think it's a way we could refer to something that is called political interest. And unless we bring accountability to politicians to reduce homicide rates for those who are being killed, notwithstanding the social status, I don't think that this convergence of political will and an effort to really address these issues today will happen.
Matt.
Yeah, just I guess I'd also like to address the question about political will, adding a layer to what Enrique just said. There's an enormous literature in my home discipline of political science about what exactly political will is. Right? I confess that I find that the phrase rather empty and unsatisfying, and I don't really know political will when I see it. Like what am I looking for? When is it absent? When is it there? In social scientists tend to think of will or that kind of political commitment in terms of material and non-material components. We could think of ideas or interests, right? And Maria Clara Costa, when asked sort of what works, right? What has worked? And you were mentioning the example of El Corral. You mentioned a few things that were interesting to me, right? Leadership, courage. Right? You could think of those things as maybe some non-material ideational components, right? They're ideas that might inhabit inside somebody's head that might give them the motivation to do something about a problem, right? We might call that will. But we could be a little bit more specific, right? Where they might be educational issues, background issues, maybe even ideology. These are all sort of ideas that might motivate somebody to do something about a particular problem. But then we get into the material components, right? Interests, incentives that might motivate, really push somebody to do something, even though they might not really sincerely want to. and again, there's a large literature on this, right? A very dominant argument is that the good thing about competitive elections is that they create material incentives to do the right thing, right? If you want to keep your office, then you need to provide some sound public policies out there. So in that regard, we want competitive elections. But that's only because they generate material interests, right, that push people to do something that, if left to their own devices, they would not choose to do on their own. So that's just all in terms of fleshing out this idea of political will. I'd love to be a part of a larger conversation about exactly what it is and how we know it when we see it. On kidnapping and homicide, I really defer to Viri because this is her area. Except that my one nagging hesitation is that we have so little data on extortion and kidnappings. At least the best victimization survey data tells us that only 1% to 2% of kidnappings are reported. And so that's a major known unknown, right? I don't know very much about kidnappings, right? And so I guess I'm hesitant to plant a flag in the ground about that. And then lastly, I just echo some of the comments by David, right, with regards to Inigo's question. As I think there's a wide range of normative and practical reasons to prefer constitutional democratic policing, not just about the various investigative, prosecutorial, adjudicatory roles that civilian institutions play versus military ones, but if I think just about some of the core lessons about community policing and what that means, and if we think about military institutions involved in those functions, then we're talking about community militarization in some way. It's not exactly clear what a community military police looks like or whether it's normatively desirable in a constitutional democracy. Military is a fantastic institution. It has a lot of respect in Mexico, and I would hate to see that be eroded because it's asked to do things that maybe it shouldn't be doing.
Matt, all of our panelists, thank you very, very much for being here. For our panelists who were here earlier on today, again, thank you so much for supporting us. To you, the audience, I hope that when we hold our annual security and rule of law review next year, that we actually are able to say that some of the ideas that are included in this book have been embraced by somebody somewhere along the chain of command. And I also hope that perhaps at some point we're able to report better news on violence, security, crime in Mexico than we have today. Thank you very much for being here. Please take the time to read the book, both the long and the short chapters. And please continue to watch this space here at the Mexico Institute. Thank you.